Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. So before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. It all started one afternoon as I watched my daughter play in the garden. The sun was shining on her blonde hair, and her laughter echoed like a melody in the warm air. It was one of those moments you want to keep forever, but fate had other plans. When the phone rang, I didn't think anything of it. I answered it distractedly, hoping it was a routine call from work or a friend wanting to arrange a meeting. But on the other end of the line, a man with a deep, cold voice gave me a clear instruction. I was to listen carefully and follow his directions if I wanted to see my daughter again. My world fell apart in that instant. I looked out into the garden and my heart stopped. The swing was still swinging gently, but she was no longer there. My eyes searched desperately everywhere, but there was no sign of her little figure. The man explained to me that he had my daughter and that I should not go to the police. If I did, I would lose her forever. He gave me an address and ordered me to go alone. There was something in his tone that chilled my blood. He didn't sound like someone who was winging it. This was a game to him, and I was just beginning to understand the rules. I drove to the appointed location with my hands trembling on the steering wheel. My mind was a chaos of dark thoughts, but I couldn't afford to lose control. I arrived at an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. The facade was corroded by time and neglect, but the lights inside indicated that it was not unoccupied. The man met me at the entrance. He wore an expensive suit, but his face had the hardness of someone accustomed to violence. He led me inside the building, where other men were waiting, all armed and with looks that could freeze the soul. He explained that he wanted me to do a job for them. My first reaction was to refuse, but before I could utter a word, he showed me a photograph. It was my daughter, with a frightened expression on her face. She was tied up in an unfamiliar room, and the mere sight of her in that state made me feel an unbearable emptiness in my chest. I accepted. I had no choice. I was given a backpack and told that I had to deliver it to a specific place the next day. Nothing else. I was not allowed to ask questions or open it. I was only to comply with the delivery and return to the warehouse for further instructions. On the way home, the silence was deafening. I looked at the backpack on the passenger seat, feeling its presence as if it were a burden that weighed more than my own soul. I knew what I was doing was illegal, but I also knew I would stop at nothing to save my daughter. That night I did not sleep. Every sound in the house seemed like a whisper of warning. I thought about my wife, to whom I had said nothing, and how I would justify my absence the next day. I hated myself for hiding the truth, but I also knew that her fear would only make the situation worse. The next day I made the delivery to an industrial area. The man who met me said nothing. He simply took the backpack and disappeared into the gloom of the buildings. When I returned to the warehouse, I was informed that the job was not finished. There were more deliveries to be made, and each one was more dangerous than the last. With each delivery, I understood better what was going on. It wasn't just smuggling. He was unwittingly helping a human trafficking ring. In the packages were not only money or drugs, but also forged documents and photographs of people, mainly women and children, who were marked as merchandise. My stomach churned every time I thought about it. I tried to find a way out. I considered running away, taking my wife and disappearing forever, but I knew they would find me. It was too big an organization with too many resources. The only way to protect my family was to take them on from the inside. I began to plan. I took advantage of every moment I was near them to observe, to learn how they worked. I discovered patterns in their movements, identified who were the ringleaders and who were just pawns. I couldn't trust anyone, but I also knew I needed allies. One night, while making one of the deliveries, I found a young woman who had been marked to be sent overseas. She was terrified, and even though I knew that helping her would endanger my life and the lives of my family, I could not ignore her. I hid her in the trunk of my car and drove her to safety. That act of rebellion was the beginning of the end. The organization discovered what I had done and began to follow me more closely. I received constant threats, but I also noticed something else. They were nervous. I had exposed a crack in their system, and that made them dangerous, but also vulnerable. My opportunity came when one of the ringleaders asked me to make a particularly important delivery. It was a large shipment, and I knew it was the perfect opportunity to expose them. I made sure to collect evidence, photographs, recordings, and documents that could incriminate them. The delivery took place in a warehouse in the port. There were more armed men than usual, and the atmosphere was charged with tension. I felt that every step I took was one step closer to my death sentence. But I also knew that if I didn't, my daughter would never come home. At the crucial moment, I activated a signal I had previously prepared. I had contacted an international organization fighting human trafficking, and that night they were ready to intervene. Chaos broke out in a matter of minutes. Sirens, gunshots, screams. I hid behind a dumpster, praying I wouldn't be hit in the crossfire. When it was all over, the men who had controlled my life for weeks were in handcuffs. They found my daughter in one of the cellar rooms. She was scared but unharmed. The moment I held her was the happiest of my life, but also the most heartbreaking. I knew I could never erase from her mind what she had experienced. We moved away from the city, away from everything. The organization had fallen, but my paranoia never left me. Every time I saw a strange car near our house, my heart would race. Every time the phone rang, I feared it was the beginning of something worse. I protected my family, but at a cost I can never measure. Those weeks left scars that will never go away, on my body, in my mind, and in my soul. Now I live with the constant reminder that darkness is always lurking, and that sometimes, to protect what you love, you must become something you were afraid to be. I grew up in a family that, at least on the surface, was like any other. We were my mother, my older brother Ismael, my younger sister Monica, and me. We lived in a modest house at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by trees that always seemed to be whispering secrets in the wind. My mother was strict but loving. Ismael was the exemplary son, and Monica was the soul of the house. Her laughter lit up the darkest corners, and her absence turned that home into a somber place. Monica died when I was 16. Her body was found in the woods behind our house one autumn morning, when the leaves were falling and covering the ground like a natural shroud. The scene was etched in my mind like a dream that never goes away when I wake up. My mother told me that it had been an accident, that Monica had probably fallen off the rope we used to swing between the trees. But something about that explanation never convinced me. The next few days were a whirlwind of crying, visits from neighbors, and awkward silences. Ishmael seemed more withdrawn than usual, and my mother set about cleaning the house compulsively, as if she could wipe away the pain with every rag she wiped across the surfaces. I, however, was caught in a state of confusion and suspicion. The details didn't add up. Monica would never have gone out into the woods alone at dusk. It was something that terrified her. Eventually, suspicions began to germinate within me. There was something strange in the way my mother avoided talking about it, in the way she averted her gaze whenever Monica was mentioned. Ismael had changed too. He was no longer the protective brother he used to be. His demeanor became colder, distant, as if he carried an invisible weight he did not want to share. The years passed, but the void Monica left was never filled. My mother continued to live in the same house, trapped in her daily rituals like a ghost, while Ismael and I took different paths. We drifted apart, though I could never shake the feeling that we both shared a secret neither of us wanted to confront. The revelation came unexpectedly one rainy night, as I helped my mother clean out the attic. Among boxes full of forgotten mementos, I found a small, blue-covered diary that I recognized instantly. It was Monica's. My heart stopped as I flipped through the pages, reading fragments of her life that I never knew. There were drawings, loose thoughts, and little stories, but what struck me most were the last few entries. In them, Monica described a growing fear of Ismael. She talked about how he would follow her into the woods, how he would watch her from a distance when she played alone, how their gazes had changed from brotherly to something darker and unknown. One of the last entries was almost illegible, but one fragment stuck in my mind. I can't tell Mom. She won't believe me. But I feel Ismael wants to hurt me. I carried the diary with me that night, unable to face my mother. The idea that Ismael might have done something to Monica terrified me, but what was worse was the possibility that my mother knew and had decided to hide it. I stayed awake all night, tossing the idea around, remembering fragments of my childhood that now took on new meaning. My mother's furtive glances at Ismael, the muffled screams I sometimes heard in the house, the moments when Monica seemed quieter than usual. My first confrontation with Ismael was months later, during a family gathering. I had had enough to drink to work up the courage, and I confronted him. I didn't accuse him directly, but my questions made him uncomfortable. I saw his mask of the perfect brother begin to crack. His answer was evasive, but something in his gaze confirmed what I already feared. There was guilt in his eyes, a weight he had carried with him since that night. That same week, I decided to confront my mother. I could no longer live in doubt. I showed her the diary, pointed to the entries that spoke of Ismael, and looked at her expecting a denial, an explanation, something that would give me back the security I had lost. But what I got was a deafening silence. My mother collapsed in front of me, and her reaction was the last piece of the puzzle. She knew. She had always known. Between sobs, she admitted that she had found Ismael that night in the woods, next to Monica's body. She told me he was in shock, mumbling incoherently about how it had all been an accident. My mother made the decision to protect him, to bury the truth, to preserve what was left of our family. She altered the scene, made up the story of the accident, and lived with the guilt eating her up inside ever since. Her confession left me cold. I felt a mixture of fury and despair that I could not contain. I turned away from her, unable to look at her. Everything I had believed about my family, about my childhood, crumbled in an instant. I spent days locked away, avoiding calls from my mother and Ismael. I didn't know what to do with the information. Should I go to the police after all these years? Should I confront Ismael directly? Finally, I made a decision. I went to the forest where Monica was found, to the place where my whole life changed. There, under the trees that had witnessed the truth, I screamed until my voice broke. I got no answers, but I felt that somehow Monica was there, listening to me. I promised her I would get justice one way or another. It wasn't easy, but I began to gather evidence to reconstruct the story that my mother and Ismael had tried to bury. I found inconsistencies in the reports of the time, details that had gone unnoticed but now seemed to confirm what I knew. When I confronted Ismael a second time, I no longer had any doubts. This time, his reaction was different. He did not deny anything. He simply looked at me, as if waiting for me to decide his fate. I don't know if I will ever be able to forgive my mother for what she did, nor do I know if I will be able to get over Ismael's betrayal, or the pain of losing Monica the way I lost her. But what I do know is that I will no longer carry the weight of her secret. The truth, as painful as it may be, is better than living in the dark. The first time I received a message from that stranger, I thought it was a mistake. My phone vibrated at the stroke of midnight, just as the rain began to hit the windows of my apartment. I was alone, as I was almost every night, and the unexpected sound pulled me out of reading a book I had started weeks ago. The message said I knew what I had done, and that I would see you soon. I didn't recognize the number. There was no greeting, no hint of who it might be. At first I ignored it. Maybe it was some practical joke, some wrong number. I deleted the message, convinced it was unimportant. The next day, however, another one arrived, this time on my way home from work. The sky was still gray and the rain wouldn't let up. I had barely left the office and my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. The message said I couldn't hide forever. I stopped dead in my tracks, surrounded by the dim streetlights. Drops slid down my face as I pulled out my cell phone to look at the screen. My heart raced irrationally. Hiding, but from what or from whom? I looked around as if expecting to find someone watching me, but the street was deserted except for the distant murmur of cars. That night, at home, I tried to convince myself that it was just someone bothering me. Perhaps a persistent mistake or a stupid prank by someone who had nothing better to do. But an uneasiness began to settle in me, something primal, as if an invisible eye was watching me from some dark corner. A couple of days passed without incident, and I began to think it was all over. But then the messages came back. They said I couldn't escape what I had done. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of the message. I looked at the cell phone screen and felt the dream fade completely. Now there was something different in the way the words were written, as if the sender was completely sure that I understood what he meant. The worst thing is that for an instant, I thought I did know. Years ago, I had made decisions I wasn't exactly proud of, but who hasn't? I was trying hard to leave those memories buried, as if they were not part of me, but those words seemed to pluck them from their grave and place them in front of my eyes. I decided to ignore them. If whoever was behind them wanted something, sooner or later they would have to reveal themselves. But the messages continued, getting more and more specific. I was coming home late from work. I had to be careful. They said they had seen me at the cafe where I used to sit by the window and knew every detail of my clothes. From the blue shirt one day to the black one the next. I felt myself falling apart. How did they know all these things? Who was behind this? I started paying more attention to my surroundings. I walked faster, watching every shadow that moved in the endless rain. Every reflection in the shop windows looked suspicious to me. Every unfamiliar face on the street, a potential threat. I tried tracing the number, but it led nowhere. I also thought about going to the police, but what could I tell them? That I was receiving messages from someone who seemed to know me too well. They would probably look at me with pity and tell me it was a joke. The nights became unbearable. I slept little, and when I did manage to close my eyes, I dreamed of hands reaching out from the shadows to catch me. A constant feeling of being watched followed me even in my own home. One day as I was leaving my building, I found a note under the windshield wiper of my car. It was a simple piece of paper soaked from the rain, but the words written in black ink made my stomach sink. It said, I was being watched. There was no doubt. This was no longer just someone sending messages. This person was close, really watching me. For the first time, I felt fear. Real, suffocating fear. I began to avoid my routine. I took different routes to work, changed my usual times and places. I even stopped going to the gym and the cafe where I always had breakfast. But nothing worked. The messages kept coming, adapting to my movements as if that stranger was one step ahead of me. One night, the situation reached its climax. The rain was torrential, an impenetrable curtain that made it impossible to see more than a couple of meters. I was in my apartment with all the lights on when my phone vibrated once again. It said I should close the curtains. I ran to the window. My apartment was on a third floor, and the street was completely empty except for the puddles reflecting the flickering lights on the poles. I slammed the curtains shut, feeling the air getting heavier by the second. Then I heard a knock. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my blood run cold. It came from the front door. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst. The knock was repeated, this time louder. I stepped back instinctively, not knowing what to do. My mind was filled with terrifying images. A stranger at the door, an intruder waiting for me to open to attack me. When I gathered enough courage, I pushed the door open. The hallway was empty. The only sign that something had happened was a white envelope someone had left on the floor. I picked it up with trembling hands and quickly closed the door. Inside, I opened the envelope. There was a single sheet of paper with a photograph on it. It was a picture of myself taken earlier that morning while walking in the rain. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the living room with a knife in my hand, listening to every sound, watching every shadow that moved across the walls. At dawn, I made the decision to leave. I left the apartment with a small suitcase, determined to disappear completely, to leave my current life behind. As I drove away from the city under a sky still covered with clouds, I received one last message. It said I could run, but they would always be behind me. The fear never left me. Even now, in this new city with a different identity and a completely different routine, every time it rains, I feel like someone is watching me from the dark. I don't know if it's paranoia or if it's really there. I just know that I will never feel safe again. I never imagined that one night my life would take a turn I couldn't control. I had left the office late, as I usually did, seeking the silence of the streets to walk a little before getting home. I had always liked the isolation of the city when the clock strikes late, as if everything that weighs during the day dissipates in the gloom. That night the rain had started gently, almost imperceptibly, but then intensified into a curtain that made the lights on the poles blur. I walked with the hood of my coat covering my head, hands in my pockets, lost in thought as the puddles grew under my feet. I decided to take a shortcut down an alley I hadn't used before. There was something appealing about the dark recesses of the city, a sense of solitude that I always found comforting. But at that moment, there was something different about the air, something heavy. Halfway down the alley, I saw two figures in the dim light of a streetlight. At first, I thought they were two people arguing, their movements erratic, as if a fight was about to break out. My first impulse was to turn away, but a mixture of curiosity and stupidity stopped me. I hid behind a dumpster, my shoes slipping slightly on the wet ground, and watched. One of the men seemed to be pleading, gesticulating desperately, while the other remained motionless with a rigid posture that conveyed only one thing: control. Suddenly, the second man stepped forward. The next thing happened so fast that it took seconds for my mind to process it. A metallic shadow glowed in the assailant's hand, and in one precise movement, he stabbed the other. The scream was brief, drowned out by the sound of the rain, and the victim's body collapsed like a severed puppet. I wanted to pull back, but my body was unresponsive. I was paralyzed, unable to look away from the scene. The assailant leaned over the body, going through his pockets with a disturbing calmness, as if what he had just done was nothing extraordinary. Then, something happened that chilled my blood. He turned his head in my direction as if he could feel that I was there, watching him. His face was partially covered by the shadow of his hat, but his eyes shone with an intensity that pierced my soul. My instinct finally awoke, and without thinking I began to back away, trying not to make a sound. But fate was not on my side that night. I stepped on a glass bottle that crunched under my weight, breaking the fragile silence of the alley. The man stood up immediately. He didn't need words to know he had seen me. He began to walk toward where I was hiding, his figure growing larger with each step, and I, moved by the most primal fear, turned and ran. My feet pounded the puddles, the sound amplified by the rain. The drops blinded me and the cold air burned my lungs. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel his presence, a shadow stretching behind me, unstoppable. I turned down another alley, hoping the darkness would protect me. The streets were a maze, and my mind tried desperately to remember the layout of the surroundings. But the rain had transformed everything into an indistinguishable landscape. My footsteps echoed on the concrete, mingling with the echoes of his. I was close, too close. My mind was torn between terror and an instinctive need to survive. At one point, I stopped behind a stack of boxes, taking cover in the shadow of a building. My breathing was heavy, and I tried to stifle it so as not to reveal my position. I heard his footsteps stop, the sound of drops hitting his coat. I heard him walk slowly, his boots echoing like war drums. I felt that at any moment he would find me, that the light in his eyes would pierce me as it had in the alley. But by some miracle, it passed me by. I waited for a few seconds that felt like forever before I came out of hiding. My mind was in chaos. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't go home. That would be taking him straight to my shelter. Nor could I stay on the street. My options were limited, and each decision seemed to bring me closer to an abyss from which I could not climb out. As I ran again, my thoughts grew darker. Was there something on my face that would give me away as a witness? Was the man so determined to eliminate me simply because I saw him? I realized I knew nothing about him except that he was meticulous and dangerous. Time seemed to vanish as I continued to run. Every corner I turned, every shadow I crossed, was a new possible encounter with my pursuer. The city, which had once been my refuge, had now transformed into a hostile place full of traps. I found an abandoned building. Its facade was covered with graffiti and broken windows. It was my only option. I went inside, climbing the metal stairs that creaked under my weight, and hid in a room on the second floor. From there, I could see the street partially illuminated by the flickering lights of the poles. The sound of rain filled the air, mixing with my agitated breathing. I tried to calm down, but my mind kept replaying the murder scene. The man's eyes, the precision of his attack, the blood mixing with the water on the ground. A few minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time became irrelevant. Then I saw him. The man was standing in the middle of the street, right in front of the building. I don't know how he had found me, but there he was, motionless, with a posture that radiated silent menace. He stood there for what seemed like ages, and then began walking toward the entrance. My heart was beating so fast I thought it would betray me, that he might hear it. I knew there was no way out. If I climbed any more floors, he would eventually find me. If I tried to run away, he would catch me. I decided to wait, hiding as best I could. The man's footsteps echoed up the stairs, each creak bringing him closer. I could imagine him walking calmly up the stairs like a predator who knows his prey has no escape. When he finally entered the room, I held my breath. The darkness was my only ally, and I clung to it as if it were a protective cloak. I watched him move slowly, his figure cut out by the dim light coming in through the broken windows. I don't know how I did it, but I mustered the courage to escape. The moment he turned the other way, I bolted. running down the stairs at full speed. I didn't care about the noise he was making. I just wanted to put as much distance between me and him as possible. I saw him for the last time from the street. He was standing at one of the windows watching me as I disappeared into the night. His silhouette remained etched in my mind long after I escaped. I never knew who he was or why he committed that murder, nor did I know how he managed to follow me with such precision. All I know is that from that night on, my life changed forever. Every shadow, every dark corner, every figure in the rain reminds me that I once witnessed something I shouldn't have seen, and that it might still be there stalking me from the shadows. I boarded the train like any other day, looking for a respite for my thoughts in the swaying of the carriage. It was a night trip, one of those that passed through the darkness between minor stations, and although the lights inside tried to give warmth, the atmosphere had a strange tension from the beginning. The passengers were mostly silent, each immersed in his or her own world, faces hidden behind newspapers, gazes fixed on phones that cast a cold glow, some dozing with bowed heads. I took a seat by the window. Outside, the landscape was an impenetrable blackness, only occasionally broken by the light of some distant house or the glimmer of a deserted road. Everything seemed normal, or so I thought, until the train came to an abrupt halt. The sound of braking echoed like a metallic scream, followed by a thud that shook all of us on board. My first thought was that we had arrived at a station, but as I looked out the window, all I saw was darkness. There were no signs, no lights, not even the vague outline of trees or mountains. The murmur spread quickly among the passengers. I felt the uneasiness begin to grow, although I tried to calm down, thinking it was just a technical glitch. Minutes passed, but the train did not move. Outside, the world remained motionless, as if we had crossed into a place where time did not exist. The tension in the carriage was palpable. Some passengers rose from their seats, looking down the aisle, waiting for an announcement or the appearance of a conductor. I stood still, watching, because something in the atmosphere told me that we should not let our guard down. The first incident occurred after 20 minutes. A middle-aged man, portly and with a sullen expression, stood up to complain in an angry voice. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but his posture was aggressive, his hand gestures sharp. It was then that someone else, a young man sitting near the door, reacted unexpectedly. With one leap, he pounced on the man, knocking him to the ground with a force that seemed out of proportion to his size. The carriage was filled with screams. Some passengers tried to intervene, but the young man turned to them with a look I will never forget. His eyes had a strange, almost animal gleam in them, as if something in him had ceased to be human. Chaos broke out. That was the spark that ignited a fire. Passengers who had previously seemed calm began to confront each other, as if something invisible had possessed them. The screams were mixed with the sound of blows and bodies falling against the walls of the carriage. I stood motionless at first, unable to understand what was happening. Then, when a man ran past my seat, brandishing a broken piece of a suitcase as if it were a weapon, I understood that I could not stand still. I stood up, looking for a place to hide or a way to get out of the carriage. The air inside the train became thick, suffocating, permeated with the smell of sweat and something more metallic, darker. I tried to reach the door that connected to the next car, but it was locked. I knocked hard, hoping that someone on the other side could open it, but I only got the echo of my own knocking as an answer. I turned around and watched the violence spread like a disease. People who minutes before were simple passengers were transformed into combatants, using anything within their reach as weapons. Umbrellas, water bottles, even the same rolled-up newspapers became tools of aggression. I saw a woman angrily punching a man who had tried to snatch her purse. Her eyes were filled with panic, but also with unbridled rage, as if this confrontation was a matter of life and death. Another man, who had remained silent throughout the trip, pulled a small knife from his jacket and began to threaten those who came too close. I could not understand it. Those people had boarded the train like any other day, with bored or tired faces, and now they were engaged in a fight that seemed to have no reason or purpose. I tried to stay out of the way, moving slowly towards the back of the carriage where there were still some empty seats. It was then that I realized that no one else had come to stop it. There were no guards, no conductors, not even a voice on the loudspeakers to try to calm the passengers. It was as if we were completely alone in that strange place, with no rules, no authority, no escape. Time became a strange concept. I don't know how long that chaos lasted, but every second felt endless. I hid behind a seat trying not to make a sound while the noise of the fight continued around me. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was all a nightmare, that I would soon wake up in my bed safe. But it wasn't a dream. When I opened my eyes, I saw something I will never forget. One of the men who had been participating in the fight lay on the ground motionless. Blood formed a dark pool under his body, and his eyes stared at the ceiling, empty, lifeless. Panic seized me. This was no longer just a confrontation, it was a massacre. I knew that if I didn't do something, I would end up like that man, another lifeless body on a train stopped in the middle of nowhere. I decided to take a chance. I waited for the moment when most of the passengers were distracted by their own fighting and ran to one of the windows. I tried to open it, but it was sealed. I pounded on the glass with all my might, to no avail. Then I heard a noise behind me. I turned around and saw one of the passengers approaching. He had a blank stare as if he was unaware of what he was doing, but in his hand he held a sharp piece of metal. I stepped back, raising my hands in a futile attempt to defend myself. Before I could react, another passenger hit him from the side, knocking him to the ground. I took advantage of the confusion to run towards the back door of the carriage, which this time I found open. I crossed to the next car, hoping things would be different there, but the horror continued. The same violence, the same madness. Men and women fighting each other, completely forgetting who they were or why they were there. There was no logic, no sense, just a primitive need to destroy. I don't know how I managed it, but I finally found an emergency door. I opened it and jumped outside. The cold rain hit my face, and the mud on the ground cushioned my fall. I ran without looking back, leaving the train and its passengers behind. The darkness of the night was now my refuge, and the sound of my own footsteps reminded me that I was still alive. But even as I ran away, I could not shake the feeling that something else had happened on that train, something beyond human folly. Now every time I see a train in the distance, I feel a knot in my stomach. I still wonder what unleashed that violence, what drove those people to become so inhuman. Maybe I will never know. I only know that that night changed my life forever, and that the shadow of that train stopped in the middle of nowhere will haunt me until the last of my days. The lonely roads had always given me a kind of strange peace. Something in the monotony of the endless asphalt and the enveloping darkness made me feel that the world stopped, that it was just me and the white line painted on the ground. This trip was no different, or so I thought at first. It was late, too late to find traffic or any reason for distraction. The only sound that broke the silence was the constant purr of the engine and, from time to time, the blow of a gust of wind against the car. I had been driving for about 5 hours with a cold coffee in the cup holder and faint music on the radio. The night seemed darker than usual, without the slightest sign of a moon. I could barely make out the shapes of the trees along the roadside. Then I saw her. She was standing at the side of the road, barely illuminated by the headlights of my car. Her figure appeared out of nowhere, as if the darkness had molded her and cast her in front of me. I braked instinctively, the screech of tires echoing in the emptiness of the night. She was a young woman with disheveled hair and clothes that seemed to have been chosen in haste. Her eyes, wide and bright, reflected something I couldn't immediately identify. Panic. For a moment I hesitated. Personal safety is one of those things one should never compromise in the middle of nowhere, but something in her gaze made me roll down the window and ask if she needed help. He got into the car without waiting for me to finish talking. As soon as he closed the door, I could feel the weight of his heavy breathing and overflowing energy. No words were needed to understand that he was running from something. I put the car in gear, pulling back onto the road with a mixture of curiosity and fear. The first few minutes were awkward. She sat quietly, hands pressed against her thighs, eyes fixed on the road in front of us. Every so often, she would turn her head back, as if expecting to see something chasing her. The air inside the car was thick, charged with a tension I couldn't ignore. I didn't know if I should ask her what had happened or just keep driving. In the end, I decided that silence was safer. As the miles passed, I began to notice things. His clothes were splattered with something dark and his hair had stuck together strands that looked wet. I thought it might be sweat or maybe rainwater, but then I remembered that the night had been completely dry. She didn't say anything for at least half an hour. She just stared straight ahead, breathing raggedly as if she was trying to calm down. But I couldn't relax. Something wasn't right. My instincts told me that whatever had put her in that state was not something I could ignore. Finally, she started to move. She leaned forward and rolled down the window a little, letting the cool night air into the car. When he returned to his position, I noticed he had something in his hands, something he had been hiding since he got in the car. A small, jagged-bladed knife. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know whether I should react or pretend I hadn't seen it. My hands gripped the steering wheel and I began to calculate my options. I could slam on the brakes and take off running, but what if she was faster? Maybe she was simply scared and was carrying it as a defense. I didn't want to make any moves that might provoke something worse. Meanwhile, she kept turning her head back, as if she was looking for something or someone on the empty road. It was then that she spoke for the first time, but not to address me. It was as if she was mumbling to herself, rapid, incomprehensible words that mingled with the noise of the engine. A shiver ran down my spine. For a moment, I thought about stopping and asking her to get out, but then, as if she had read my thoughts, she turned to me. His eyes, filled with a mixture of fear and despair, pierced me. I felt I was trapped. I couldn't stop now. The landscape around us was becoming increasingly barren. The trees began to disappear, replaced by open fields that seemed to stretch into infinity. It was a perfect place to disappear, I thought. A place where no one would find a trace of a car, a man, or a woman. That's when I saw the lights in the rearview mirror. A pair of bright headlights appeared in the distance, rapidly approaching. My passenger immediately tensed, sinking into the seat as if to make herself invisible. She muttered something else, this time with a more frantic tone, and her hands trembled as they clutched the knife. I didn't know what to do. If that car caught up with us, what would that mean? Were they really chasing her? Or was it all a product of her paranoia? My thoughts were a whirlwind, but my hands were still firmly on the steering wheel. The car behind us moved even closer, until I could see the make of the model and the license plate. I knew in that instant that it was no coincidence. The headlights seemed to bore into us, a relentless eye that wouldn't let us escape. She leaned toward me, whispering something I didn't understand. Her breath was warm, but her presence chilled my blood. She pointed her hand toward a turnoff that I could barely make out in the darkness. Without thinking too hard, I turned sharply, turning off the main road and onto a dirt road that seemed to go into nowhere. The car behind us soon followed. Now it was a chase, and I was the driver of a getaway I didn't understand. My passenger was clinging to the dashboard, her knife still in her hand, as the bumps in the road made the car shake and creak. The terrain was becoming increasingly difficult to traverse. My tires were skidding in the mud, and every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I could see the lights of the other car getting closer. The thought of this ending badly became more real with every second. Eventually, the road narrowed to a path that the car could barely make it across. I slammed on the brakes, knowing we couldn't continue. Before I could think of a plan, she opened the door and ran out into the darkness, disappearing into the trees that now surrounded the path. I stayed in the car, paralyzed. I could hear the engine of the other car approaching, and my mind was blank. It had all happened too fast, and I didn't know who to trust, not even myself. The lights of the other car stopped a few meters away. I could see the silhouette of someone getting out of the vehicle, but the darkness was too dense to make out details. Then, the sound of footsteps crunched in the underbrush. She ran back, but something on her face had changed. She was covered in dirt and leaves, and her eyes had a ferocity in them that wasn't there before. She shouted something at me, though I couldn't make it out, and then disappeared again, this time leaving the knife on the car seat. The next minute was chaos. Footsteps came closer. Shadows moved quickly around me, and the headlights of the car parked behind me illuminated for a second something I didn't quite manage to identify. A body lying on the ground stained red before the lights suddenly went out. The silence that followed was deafening. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to find the key to start the engine. When I finally succeeded, I drove back to the main road, not looking back, leaving everything that had happened buried in that darkness. Even now, weeks later, I still don't know who she was, what was chasing her, or what part I played in it all. But every time I pass a lonely road and see someone asking for a ride, a shiver runs through me, because I know that there are things in the night that should remain in the dark, far from anyone looking for answers. I'd always liked working in coffee shops at night. There was something about the quiet atmosphere, the constant sound of the espresso machine, and the murmur of soft music that provided me with a kind of calm. It was a refuge, a space between the chaos of the day and the eerie silence of the early morning. The cafe where I worked closed at midnight. My shifts ended a little later, once I had cleaned the machines and left the tables ready for the next day. Sometimes I would meet peculiar customers at those hours, people who preferred the anonymity of darkness to sit with their thoughts. But never in all my years behind the counter had I encountered someone like him. That night seemed no different from any other. The rain was falling lightly outside, fogging up the windows and creating distorted reflections of the neon lights on the cafe sign. I had hardly had any customers for the past few hours, and the clock was already striking 11:30. I was wiping down the bar when I heard the doorbell ring. I looked up, expecting to see some straggler looking for a quick coffee before closing, but what I saw made me stop. It was a man in his 40s, dressed in a long, dark coat. His hair was slicked back, still damp from the rain, and his eyes, they were hard to describe. There was something about them that made me uneasy, as if they were too clear, too penetrating. He slowly approached the bar, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. I watched him as he sat down on one of the stools, dropping his wet coat on the back. He didn't look like someone who needed coffee to stay awake. Rather, he looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. I poured him a cup of coffee without his asking for it. He hadn't exchanged words with me, but his look was enough to make me understand that he was there for a reason. His long, slender fingers wrapped around the cup as he blew out the steam, and in that instant I felt an inexplicable shiver. I tried to concentrate on my chores, cleaning the espresso machine, checking inventory, anything that would allow me to divert my attention from him. But it was impossible. His presence filled the space, making the normally cozy cafe feel cold and oppressive. That's when he spoke. I don't remember exactly how he started, but his words were hypnotic. There was something in his tone that compelled me to listen, as if I was being pulled into a story I couldn't escape. He told me about decisions, about dark paths people take when there is no other way out. He described in detail how sometimes in life we reach a point where we are unable to distinguish between the right and the inevitable. Every word he said seemed to tear something out of me, as if he knew my own fears, my deepest regrets. At some point he mentioned that he had been visiting cafes like this for years, looking for someone who could understand what he had done. He said it wasn't easy to find the right person, but he always knew when he had found them. My hands began to shake as I wiped the bar. I didn't know if I was imagining things or if his words had a darker purpose. My heart was pounding, and a primal instinct told me that I should throw him out, that I should close the cafe and run away. But I didn't. I couldn't. There was something in his voice and the way he described his secrets that paralyzed me. His stories began to become more personal, more graphic. He spoke of a specific act, something he had done years ago. He didn't say exactly what. What was certain was that the words he used painted images in my mind that I wished I had never seen. He described a moment of anger, of loss of control, and how after that, he had tried to redeem himself. But he also made it clear that there was no redemption for him, that what he had done was irreparable. What disturbed me even more was the way he talked about me, as if he knew me. He mentioned things that no one else could know, details of my life that I had never shared with anyone. At first I thought it was coincidence, that maybe he was projecting his own fears onto me. But then he said something that chilled my blood, a specific memory from my childhood, something I had buried so deeply that I barely remembered it myself. My breathing became heavy. I tried to remain calm, but it felt as if the air in the room had become thicker, harder to breathe. The man kept talking, and every word he spoke made me feel more vulnerable, more exposed. There was a darkness about him that seemed to seep into the atmosphere, as if he was polluting the space around us. It was then that I saw him. On the table, next to his coffee cup, he had left something that wasn't there before. It was a small object gleaming in the dim light of the coffee. I recognized it instantly, a ring. It was not just any ring. It was identical to one I had lost years ago, one that had belonged to my father. How did he have it? My thoughts became chaotic. I tried to rationalize it, to look for a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. The man wasn't just a stranger. There was something else about him, something I couldn't understand. At that moment, I felt that everything clicked, though not in the way I wanted it to. He hadn't come into the cafe by chance. He had come for me. The clock struck midnight. The sound of the door chime brought me out of my paralysis. When I looked up, however, the man was gone. His cup was still there, half empty, and the ring glistened in the light. I ran out the door, searching the deserted street. The rain had stopped, and all was silent. There was no sign of him, no footprints on the wet ground, nothing to indicate that he had ever been there. I returned to the cafe, locked the door, and dropped behind the counter. The ring was still there, reminding me that what had just happened was not a figment of my imagination. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the bar, staring at the ring and going over every word the man had said. I don't know how long it was before dawn began to light up the sky. The next morning, I tried to go on with my life, but something had changed. Every time I poured a cup of coffee, I felt like someone was watching me. Every time I closed the coffee at night, I expected to hear the door chime once again. The ring is tucked away in a drawer, but I can't get rid of it. And although I would never admit it out loud, I know that someday the man will come back. Not because I want him to, but because it was meant to be. Because some stories don't end when we think they do. It was one of those nights where the air seemed to be charged with more than just humidity. I had left work late, and tiredness weighed on my shoulders as I walked through the almost deserted streets of downtown. The yellowish lights on the poles barely illuminated the sidewalks, and the feeling of emptiness was mixed with a strange uneasiness that I could not identify. I had no reason to deviate from my usual route, but something pushed me to take a shortcut through an alley. Perhaps it was the need to get home faster, or perhaps an unconscious curiosity that led me into the unknown. As I moved forward, the shadows seemed to lengthen, and each step echoed with an echo that made me feel watched. It was then that I saw him. He was standing in the flickering light of a streetlight, motionless as a statue. His silhouette was tall and thin, wrapped in a coat that seemed to absorb the darkness around him. Although I couldn't make out the details of her face, there was something about her posture that chilled my blood. I shouldn't have approached, but my feet kept moving forward, as if an invisible force was pulling me toward him. When I was close enough, I noticed he was carrying something in his hands, a small, worn briefcase. He held it with an unsettling calmness, as if it were the most important piece in the world. There was a strange energy in the air, a tension that made every fiber in my body want to turn and run. But I didn't. Somehow he began to speak. He didn't need words to convey to me what he wanted. Every gesture, every look embedded itself in my mind like a clear message. He was offering me something, a deal. At first the idea seemed absurd, almost laughable, but as his unspoken words settled into my consciousness, I began to understand the nature of his proposal. It was a game, he was telling me, one that involved risk, skill, and a considerable dose of luck. If I accepted, the rewards would be unimaginable. If I failed, I didn't quite understand what failure meant, but the way his eyes, those dark shafts that seemed to lack a soul, bore into mine made it clear to me that it wasn't something I wanted to find out. The briefcase opened in front of me, revealing a set of objects that looked like something out of a fever dream. There was an antique dice carved from dark wood, with numbers that appeared to be handwritten. Next to it, an hourglass with black sand that seemed to absorb what little light there was. The rest of the contents were shrouded in mystery that only added weight to the decision I had to make. I don't really know why I agreed. Perhaps curiosity, or maybe the desire to get out of the monotony that had enveloped my life. But as I took the die in my hands, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The stranger nodded slowly as if he already knew my answer from the beginning. The game began at that moment. The first roll of the die transported me to a different place. Not physically, but the reality around me changed in a way that was impossible to ignore. I was in an empty park, under a sky that seemed neither day nor night. The wind was blowing leaves that never fell to the ground, and a distant, wailing-like sound was filtering through the trees. Then I saw it. A hooded figure watched me from a distance, motionless like a petrified shadow. It had no face, but its presence was overwhelming, as if it were waiting for my next move. The hourglass began to spin, and the black sand slowly began to fall. I didn't know what I should do, but I understood that I had to act before time ran out. I started running, looking for something that would explain the purpose of this test. The minutes passed with agonizing slowness, and each step I took seemed to draw the hooded figure closer to me. Finally, I found a key hanging from a low branch. As soon as I touched it, the park crumbled around me like a mirage. I was back in the alley, with the die still in my hand, and the stranger silently watching me. The game continued. Each roll of the die dragged me into a new scenario, each one more disturbing than the last. A room full of mirrors that reflected distorted versions of myself. An endless hallway where each door led to a place more terrifying than the last. A deserted square where I heard whispers but never saw anyone. Every time I completed a test, I felt something inside me crack a little more. My mind was on the verge of collapse, but the stranger was always there, impassive, holding the hourglass as a reminder that time was never on my side. With each turn, the rules of the game became clearer, yet more deadly. There was something searching in me, something I could not identify but which seemed to feed on my fear and despair. I was beginning to understand that this was not just a game. It was a trial of sorts, a test of character that I didn't know if I was destined to pass. In one of the last rounds, the dice brought me to a crossroads. In front of me were two doors, both the same in appearance, but each emanating a different energy. One felt cold like death itself, while the other seemed to pulsate with an eerie, almost feverish life. I knew I had to choose, but the hourglass was almost empty. Panic gripped me as I tried to decide, and in the end I flung myself toward the beating door. The place I arrived at was worse than any other. A maze of living walls that breathed with every step I took. The air was laden with an unbearable stench, and the echoes of my own footsteps seemed to become screams. I felt that something was following me, something I never saw, but whose presence was undeniable. When I finally found the exit, I was back in the alley, but this time something had changed. The stranger was not holding the hourglass. Instead, he was holding the die in his hands, and he extended it to me one last time. I understood that this was the final turn, the last chance to win or lose. With every fiber of my being resisting, I took the die and rolled it one more time. The result was a 6. The stranger smiled, or so I thought I saw in the gloom of his face. The briefcase closed with a snap, and the feeling of tightness in the air began to dissipate. For a moment I thought I had won, that it was all over. But then I felt something in my pocket. I pulled it out and found a small die identical to the one I had used during the game. Reality bent around me, and I understood with terrifying clarity that the game was not over. It never would. The stranger disappeared into the shadows, and I was left alone in the alley, the die burning in my hand. Since that night, every decision I make, every path I choose, seems dictated by an unseen force I cannot control. The game goes on, and I am its only player. I never thought I would need a therapist. All my life I had taken things in stride, dealing with problems as anyone would, swallowing my frustration and leaving it buried somewhere in the back of my mind. But a year ago, after a series of events that I prefer not to detail, I began to feel that everything was falling apart. The days were gray, the nights were endless. I couldn't sleep, I barely ate, and when I did, I felt like a constant weight was crushing me. That's how I arrived at Dr. Enrique Salazar's office. His name popped up in a quick internet search. He had good reviews, and his voice on the other end of the phone was calm, almost hypnotic. I got the impression that he was someone who could help me, and at that point I was willing to grasp at anything. The office was simple but cozy, with warm-toned walls and carefully arranged furniture. There was something about his presence that put me at ease from the first moment. He was a man in his 50s, with a penetrating gaze that seemed to pierce you as if he could read your deepest thoughts without you having to say a word. At first, the sessions were normal, or so I thought. I talked about my childhood, my frustrations at work, the loneliness that had consumed me since my last failed relationship. Enrique listened attentively, nodding occasionally, asking questions that seemed to open closed doors inside my mind. It was a strange but also liberating feeling, as if someone was finally interested in understanding me. However, things began to change. Enrique's questions became more personal, more incisive. He would make me explore thoughts I had never considered before, dark desires and emotions I thought were non-existent. He would talk to me about anger, how it could be a powerful force if directed correctly. He said anger wasn't always bad. Of course, in retrospect, I understand that this was a carefully planted seed. I don't know exactly at what point the manipulation began. It was so subtle that I barely noticed it. Maybe it was the session where we talked about the injustices of life, how certain people seem to thrive at the expense of others. Or maybe it was when he asked me to imagine what it would be like to have absolute control over my destiny without hindrance or interference. What I do remember clearly is the moment he mentioned Alvaro, a coworker who had been a thorn in my side for months. Alvaro was the type of person who always found a way to belittle you, to steal credit for your effort while smiling as if he was doing you a favor. He wasn't a bad person, or so I thought at the time, but every interaction with him left me feeling smaller, more insignificant. Enrique seemed fascinated by my stories about Alvaro. He encouraged me to delve deeper into those feelings of frustration, to describe in detail how his actions affected me. Gradually, those sessions began to focus more on Alvaro and less on me. "What would you do if Alvaro was no longer in your life?" he asked me on one occasion. The question stayed with me, repeating like an echo in my mind long after the session would end. At first, I tried to ignore it, but each time I returned to work, every interaction with Alvaro made the idea gain more force. I found myself imagining scenarios in which he simply disappeared, in which I could finally breathe without his shadow over me. The sessions with Enrique took a darker turn. He would talk to me about justice, about how sometimes it was necessary to take drastic action to correct the imbalances in the world. "Some people deserve their fate," he once told me. And though I didn't think much of it at the time, those words began to take on unsuspected weight. One night, after a particularly bitter discussion with Alvaro in the office, I received an email from Enrique. It was strange because he had never contacted me outside the sessions before. The message was brief, but it contained a phrase that stuck in my mind. "Sometimes, the power is in your hands, you just have to take it." From that moment on, my life began to become a whirlwind. I could not think of anything else but Alvaro and Enrique's words. I began to have dreams in which I confronted him, in which I took control in a way I had never imagined before. The worst thing was that when I woke up, I felt no remorse, but a strange sense of relief, of liberation. One day, Enrique gave me an assignment. He asked me to write down my darkest thoughts, to put them down on paper as an exercise in catharsis. "I won't judge anything you put down," he assured me. So I did. I wrote about my hatred for Alvaro, about how I wished he would disappear from my life, about the minute details of what it would be like to confront him for good. When I showed him what I had written, Enrique smiled in a way that set my nerves on edge. "This is good," he said. "Very good." Soon after, I found myself doing things I never thought I would do. I began following Alvaro around outside of work, observing his routines, learning his schedules. I felt like a spectator in my own life, watching him make decisions that didn't feel like my own. But at the same time, there was something addictive about it, a sense of control I had never experienced before. Enrique encouraged me every step of the way. He never explicitly told me what to do, but his words were full of suggestions, hints that pushed me further and further toward the edge. "Sometimes, to find peace, we must face our demons," he would tell me, and I, in my confused state, interpreted this as a sign that I should act. The day came without me really planning it. It was a rainy night, like so many others, and Alvaro was leaving the office late. I followed him to the parking lot, my hands shaking and my heart beating like a drum. There was hardly any light, only the distorted reflections of the poles in the puddles that formed on the ground. I can't explain what happened at that moment. All I remember is the adrenaline, the sound of my own footsteps approaching, and then the absolute silence when it was all over. I stood there in the rain looking at what I had done. I felt no relief, no satisfaction, just a crushing emptiness that left me paralyzed. When I finally mustered the courage to leave, I promised myself that I would never speak of it again, not even to Enrique. But he already knew. When I walked into his office days later, he looked at me with that unwavering smile and simply said, "I knew you could do it." It was then that I understood the magnitude of what had happened. Enrique was not my therapist. He was the architect of my destruction. Every word, every suggestion, every look had been carefully calculated to bring me to that moment. I walked away from his office that day and never returned. But his influence never really left me. Even now, on rainy nights when the water hits the windows and the world seems to wrap itself in shadows, I feel her voice in my mind, reminding me that it all started with a simple desire to find help. Was I a victim of her manipulation, or did she simply awaken something that was always inside me? I will never know. I only know that the weight of what I did is mine to bear, and that Enrique somehow achieved what he set out to do from the beginning, to make me the instrument of his own twisted vision of the world. The night was dark and silent when I got home, a silence that felt out of place. I'd been away for a few days, a business trip that extended longer than expected. As I opened the door, the cold, stagnant air greeted me like an uncomfortable embrace. Moonlight filtered faintly through the curtains, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I called out to my family, hoping to hear the echo of their laughter, or at least a response, but the silence continued. I walked down the hallway feeling a growing uneasiness in my chest. The house, which used to be full of life, looked like a mausoleum. Family photos hung on the walls, smiles frozen in time, but at that moment, they only reminded me of what I had lost. Every room I passed was a reminder of the emptiness that had taken over my home. I walked into the living room. The couch was in disarray, as if someone had been there recently. The blanket my wife always used was fallen on the floor, and a cold cup of coffee rested on the table, like a remnant of an interrupted conversation. A pang of anxiety shot through me. I headed for the kitchen, hoping to find some clue, something to tell me everything was all right, but the kitchen was empty. The refrigerator light illuminated the interior, revealing nearly empty shelves, only a few perishables that had not been consumed. My heart began to pound. I climbed the stairs, each step echoing in the silence. My children's rooms were locked. The doors were ajar, and the hallway felt longer than usual. I called their names in a voice that sounded strange in my ears. The answer was an empty echo. My daughter's room was tidy, the dolls lined up on a shelf, as if awaiting her return. My son's room, on the other hand, was untidy, the toys scattered on the floor, silent witnesses to a game that had never ended. Feeling increasingly uneasy, I decided to investigate further. I went down to the basement. The door creaked open, and a blast of cold air hit me in the face. The stairs seemed endless, and the trembling light from the flickering bulb only added to my unease. The basement was a place I had always avoided, full of boxes and forgotten memories. I walked through the shadows, feeling something watching me, something lurking in the darkness. I found nothing unusual, only the accumulation of dust and cobwebs. However, as I turned to leave, I noticed that the door had slowly closed behind me. A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to open it, but it was stuck. The flickering light became even more erratic, and the air became heavy. My heart was pounding wildly as I pounded on the door, calling out for my family, even though I knew they weren't there. After what seemed like an eternity, the door finally gave way, and I emerged from the basement feeling as if I had escaped a nightmare. I needed answers. I returned to the foyer and looked for my phone, but it wasn't in its usual place. I looked around the house, uneasy, each passing second increasing my anxiety. However, my phone signal was non-existent. I decided to go out to look for help. The night was dark and the street was empty. The lights of the neighboring houses were flickering, but I saw no one on the road. I called my neighbors, but there was no answer. A sense of isolation came over me. I walked to the corner of the street where the headlight dimly illuminated the darkness. I returned home, feeling more lost than before. I decided to check the car. Maybe someone had left a message or a trace of what had happened. When I opened the door, the interior was empty. The radio was still on, playing a soft melody that contrasted with the growing sense of despair in my chest. I reached into the glove compartment and found an old map of the city, crumpled and forgotten. At that moment, I realized I had no idea where they might be. I went back inside, determined to look for more clues. Each room seemed to hold secrets I wasn't ready to discover. In the office, I found a photo album. The pictures showed happy times, but as I turned the pages, I noticed that several recent photos were missing. I wondered if they had gone on a trip without me, but the idea felt strange, implausible. The night wore on, and anguish turned to despair. I sat on the couch trying to calm my mind. The house was silent, but a whisper seemed to come from the kitchen. I stood up, feeling a mixture of fear and curiosity. As I approached, I discovered that the sound was simply the wind coming through an open window. The icy breeze made my skin crawl. As the night slipped into the early morning, The feeling that something was not right grew stronger. The house, though familiar, had transformed into a strange labyrinth. Darkness seemed to creep up the walls, and the echo of my own thoughts felt like a taunt. The thought that my family had disappeared without a trace haunted me. Unanswered questions swirled in my mind. Where were they? Why hadn't they left a clue? I decided to call the police. I looked up the number in the phone book, but the line was dead. I couldn't believe it. With each attempt, frustration grew, and a sense of helplessness came over me. I opened the door and stepped outside, determined to find someone who could help me. The street was deserted, and the fog was beginning to envelop everything in its path. I walked towards a neighbor's house, but when I got there, I noticed that the lights were off. I looked around, searching for any sign of life. It was as if the entire town had been abandoned. The shadows lengthened and twisted, and the night seemed to laugh at my despair. I returned home, feeling anxiety consume me. I knew there must be something I wasn't seeing. I checked every corner, every closet, every drawer. The feeling that someone was watching me would not leave me alone. Finally, I went to the master bedroom and looked in the closet. There, I found a diary that belonged to my wife. The pages were full of reflections and dreams, but as I reached the last few entries, I noticed that the writing became more erratic. Her last entry spoke of an uneasy feeling, a dark foreboding that seemed to grow with each day. Fear gripped me as I read her words. The last line said that she had seen something she could not explain, something that had left her terrified. At that moment, I understood that the silence in the house was not just an absence, but a presence. Something had disturbed our home. The night continued to progress, and my mind filled with distorted images of what might have happened. The idea that something supernatural was at play terrified me. I felt trapped in a dream from which I could not awaken. Desperation drove me to go outside again, the need to find answers pushing me forward. I walked through the empty streets looking for some sign of my family. The lights of the houses glowed dimly, as if they too were trapped in a dream. But when I looked closer, I noticed that some windows were sealed shut. It was as if the neighbors were also hiding something. The feeling of being watched returned, and the air felt thicker and thicker. Finally, I found the police station. As I entered, the cold white light greeted me, but the room was empty. The counter was deserted, and the silence was overwhelming. I pounded on the counter in frustration, but there was no response. Despair turned to panic. I ran for the door, feeling the madness begin to take hold of me. I stepped out into the street, and the wind howled like a whale. I returned home, feeling more lost than ever. Days turned into weeks, and my search became an obsession. The police finally arrived, but their investigations yielded no results. My children, my wife, all missing without a trace. Reports piled up, but the leads led to nothing. Years passed, and although life went on, I was still trapped on that fateful day. The house became a place of memories, a mausoleum of what had been. The shadow of the unknown loomed over me, and the echo of their laughter slowly faded in my mind. The nights were long and lonely, and silence became my only companion. The police never found my family. Investigations stopped, and time faded into hopelessness. Every corner of the house reminded me of what I had lost, and every day I wondered what had happened. All that remained were unanswered questions and a deep emptiness in my heart. I didn't know if I would ever find the truth, but I knew that oblivion was becoming my only reality. The rain was falling incessantly that night, creating a constant murmur that mixed with the sound of the wind. I was in a deserted bus station, a makeshift shelter from the storm that was battering the city. The drops were hitting the metal roof with an eerie rhythm, as if nature itself was warning of what was about to happen. I had arrived at the station after missing the last bus that was to take me home. The night had turned dark and cold, and I had no choice but to wait in that gloomy place. The waiting room was small and dimly lit, with a few worn plastic chairs and a couple of vending machines that didn't look like they had been stocked in weeks. The atmosphere was thick, charged with a sense of unease. As I looked out the window, I watched the rain form small rivers running down the pavement. A few minutes passed, and the loneliness began to take hold of me. In the distance, I noticed the silhouette of a woman approaching, a worn suitcase in her hand. She sat in the corner opposite mine, avoiding any eye contact. The tension in the air was palpable, as if we both knew the night was not yet over. Suddenly, a piercing scream broke the silence. The woman jumped to her feet, and so did I. The sound came from outside. The sound came from outside, and my instinct led me to approach the door to see what had happened. As I opened it, a blast of cold air hit me, and water instantly drenched me. The sight was chaotic. A group of people had gathered a few meters away, and in the center a man lay on the ground, motionless, surrounded by a pool of blood mingling with the rain. Panic took hold of me. The woman with the suitcase had disappeared, and the sound of murmuring filled the air. I tried to back away toward the safety of the station, but the stares of the crowd turned toward me as if they were silently accusing me. Something in their eyes made me feel that I too was part of this horror. The police arrived quickly, and with them, an officer approached me. His gaze was piercing and his voice was firm. He asked me where I had been, and although I told him I was inside the station, his expression showed no conviction. As he turned away to talk to other witnesses, the feeling of being the suspect began to consume my thoughts. The crowd dispersed, but I remained there, a spectator to a tragedy I had not chosen. The rain continued to fall, and the sound of sirens mingled with the incessant murmur of the storm. When the officer returned, he asked me to accompany him to the police station to answer some questions. The pressure in my chest intensified. I couldn't believe I was being dragged into this. The police station was close, but the ride was a whirlwind of terrifying thoughts. Upon arrival, I was ushered into an interrogation room. The atmosphere was somber, and the walls seemed to close in around me. As I waited, memories of my daily life faded. All I could think about was the dead man and how I had become the focus of the investigation. A detective walked in. His gaze was hard and his voice authoritative. He began to question me about the night and what I had seen. I tried to explain that I had only been waiting for my bus, that I didn't know the victim, but every word out of my mouth seemed to make his expression grow more skeptical. I felt him examining me, looking for any hint of guilt in my eyes. The feeling of being a prisoner grew in me. After what seemed like an eternity, they let me go, but not before warning me not to leave town and to be available for further questions. I left the police station with my head full of doubts. The rain had increased, and every drop that fell on me seemed a reminder of my situation. I walked through the deserted streets feeling more alone than ever. No one could understand the mixture of fear and uneasiness that enveloped me. The days passed, and the storm did not cease. Every time I heard a scream or a whisper, fear gripped me. The police kept calling, and every time they did, I felt like the air was being sucked out of me. My days became a routine of anxiety. Every glance I received on the street seemed to be laden with judgment. The feeling of being an outcast intensified, and the rain became my only companion. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard a knock at the door. I jumped up, fear coursing through my body. Opening the door, I found a strange man wearing a dark trench coat and a hat that partially covered his face. His presence was unsettling, but there was a glint of urgency in his eyes. He told me about a woman who had been at the station the night of the murder. She said she had seen what happened, but she was scared. She explained that she needed my help, that there was something bigger at stake than the man's death. The feeling of hope was mixed with fear, but I knew I couldn't turn it down. The man gave me an address and disappeared as quickly as he had arrived. With my heart pounding, I decided that I should go to where he had directed me. I dressed quickly, hoping that this was the opportunity I had been waiting for. I took a cab and asked him to take me to the address. The ride was tense. Every second felt like an eternity. I arrived at a small motel on the outskirts of town. The rain was coming down hard and the place looked bleak and abandoned. With my heart in my throat, I went inside and asked for the woman. The receptionist looked at me suspiciously, but finally gave me a room. I went upstairs and knocked on the door. The woman appeared, and upon seeing her, a mixture of relief and fear came over me. She explained that she had been running away, that she feared for her life. She had seen what happened that night. The man who died was not a random victim, but part of a dangerous game between criminals. Terror gripped me as I listened to her story. The connection between his story and mine was undeniable. I knew that if we didn't do something soon, I would never be able to prove my innocence. Time was running out. We needed to find evidence that would corroborate her testimony and free me from the shadow of guilt that followed me. We decided we needed to get out of the motel and find more information. We had to act quickly. Every step seemed to echo on the soggy ground. We walked toward the center of town, where we thought we might find someone who knew more about the case. The tension in the air was palpable, and fear hung over us like a shadow. Arriving at a small cafe, we entered and sat down at a secluded table. We chatted quietly, trying not to draw attention to ourselves. The woman who ran the place explained to me that there was a man, a former friend of her brother's, who could help us. His name was Javier, and he knew more about the dark world the dead man was involved in. The rain continued to fall as we thought about how to locate Javier. The woman looked at me with determination, and her gaze gave me strength. I knew we had to find him, and that time was running out. The feeling of being a prisoner in my own life was overwhelming, but I would not give up. Then we found Javier's address. It was a place in a rundown neighborhood where the rain was pouring down on the worn streets. As we arrived, I felt a little unsure, but she took my hand, giving me courage. We knocked on the door, and after a few moments, a scruffy-looking man opened it. Javier looked at us suspiciously, but when he heard our story, his expression changed. He invited us in, and as we talked, we explained everything we knew. The atmosphere became tense, and he began to talk about the criminal network operating in the city and how the dead man was part of it. Javier told us about a file that might contain incriminating evidence. I knew it was a risk, but it was our only chance to clear my name. We looked at each other for a moment, and the decision was unanimous. We had to take the risk. We headed for the government office where the documents were kept. The tension was palpable as we walked through the rain, feeling time slipping away. We arrived at the building. There was a tense atmosphere. We entered, and with each step my heart was racing. We made our way to the office Javier had mentioned, and as we arrived, fear gripped me. The door was locked, but I managed to open it carefully. The office was in disarray, and my mind was racing as I searched for the computer. Finally, I found it and turned on the screen. As I was browsing through the files, I heard a noise in the hallway. Adrenaline kicked in, and my heart stopped. I had to be quick. I found a document that contained the information we needed and saved it to a USB. But just as I was about to leave, I saw the shadows of several figures approaching. I ran for the door, and the woman followed me. We exited the building, feeling the air thicken around us. Then we quickly made our way to the car. As we drove, the reality of what we had done began to settle in on me. I had the document that could prove my innocence. I had to go to the felony unit and present the evidence. But the fear was still lurking, and the uncertainty was overwhelming. We arrived at the felony unit, and the sky was still covered with dark clouds. We entered, and as we made our way to the front desk, I felt like a prisoner. An officer led us into an interrogation room. I felt the air become thick as I waited for the other officer to arrive. When he entered, his gaze was piercing, and his voice was firm. He began to ask me questions, but this time I had evidence. I handed him the USB with the information, and as he reviewed it, the tension in the air became palpable. The rain was still falling outside, but at that moment I felt there was a chance for redemption. The truth could come out. Minutes passed, and the officer looked at the document in disbelief. He began to ask more questions, and in the end, his expression changed. He knew the truth was more complex than he had imagined. As the officer spoke on the phone to verify the information, I looked at the woman. She smiled, and for the first time in days, I felt a spark of hope. Although I didn't know what would happen next, I had found the strength to face the truth that had been eluding me. Finally, the officer hung up and turned to me. The look in his eyes had changed. "You seem to have a lot of explaining to do, but this may be the beginning of your redemption," he said, and I felt the weight of the world slowly melt away. The storm was over, and although the road ahead remained uncertain, I knew I had found the strength to face what was to come. As the tension in the interrogation room began to dissipate, the officer leaned toward me, his expression serious but less threatening. "The information you provided is valuable. We will investigate further, but you will need cooperation and protection. We'll let you know about next steps." With each step, I felt lighter, as if the shadows that had haunted my life were beginning to fade. As we pulled away from the station, I realized that not only had I survived the storm, but I had found a new reason to fight. The truth, though painful, was the light that would guide my path, and with the woman by my side, I was ready to face whatever came. The afternoon was slowly falling, tinting the sky a deep orange and lengthening shadows. I was walking through the park where I used to spend hours of my childhood, a place that had once been synonymous with laughter and games. Today, however, it had a different feel to it, an eerie silence enveloping me as I walked the familiar path. Nostalgia pulled me back to distant memories. but also an uneasy feeling that I could not ignore. The park was almost deserted save for a couple of joggers and a mother with her toddler on a swing. As I moved on, I noticed a lone figure sitting on a bench, partially hidden by the shadow of an old oak tree. As I approached, a surge of recognition hit me. It was Daniel, an old high school classmate. It had been a decade since I'd last seen him, and though our lives had taken different directions, a part of me was intrigued to meet him again. Daniel had been a peculiar guy in school. He always stood out for his intelligence, but there was also something unsettling about him, an aura of mystery that surrounded him. I remember that he often stood on the sidelines of conversations, silently observing. What struck me most was the sudden disappearance of his family during our senior year. The news had shaken our small community, and although there was much speculation, no clear answer was ever found. Daniel moved away soon after, and with him, the echo of those dark rumors. Today, seeing him again, I felt an indescribable uneasiness. He sat with his head lowered, lost in thought. Something in his posture made me doubt, but curiosity overcame caution, and I decided to approach. "Hello, Daniel," I thought to myself, even though I knew there was no way he would hear me. In my mind, I rehearsed the words I might say, but the moment I reached his side, I fell silent. Daniel's gaze lifted, and in his eyes I saw a hint of surprise, followed by a shadow of distrust. I sat down on the bench, keeping a safe distance. The air felt thick, as if the world around us had stopped. I looked at his face, marked by time and experience. Although there was something familiar about him, there was an unsettling change. His expression was one of concentration, as if he was weighing his dark thoughts. As we both gazed off into the horizon, silently, my mind began to wander. I remembered those school days, the shared laughter and mischief. But I also remembered the furtive glances Daniel used to cast when we talked about his family, the nervousness in his voice when asked about them. It was as if behind that facade of normalcy lurked a secret that no one had managed to decipher. "What brings you back to this place?" I thought I could ask him, but the question got caught in my throat. Instead, I decided to watch him in silence. The evening grew darker, and a cold breeze began to blow, bringing with it a damp, earthy smell that reminded me of the coming storm. Suddenly, Daniel broke the silence. He muttered in a barely audible tone, "I shouldn't be here." His words were like an echo in the air. I felt a shiver run through me, and a part of me was drawn to the darkness that seemed to envelop him. Something in him was deeply disturbed, and though I didn't know what it was, my curiosity was stronger than fear. I felt compelled to ask, though the words refused to come out. As the daylight faded, the tension in the atmosphere became palpable. Daniel continued to stare toward the horizon, as if waiting for something. The silence became deafening, and my mind began to formulate theories about what he might be hiding. Almost before I knew it, the wind began to blow harder, bringing with it a strange murmur, as if the park was talking. The feeling of isolation deepening, I sensed something was about to happen. With a sudden movement, Daniel turned to me, his eyes shining with a haunting intensity. "Some things you don't forget," he said, though there was no dialogue between us. The way he said it gave me the impression that he was talking about something much deeper, something that went beyond simple memories. As I looked up into his face, I saw a flash of despair. "I can't escape what happened," he continued, and although he didn't utter words, his expression was clear. At that moment, I understood that his life had been marked by a tragic event, one that had left an indelible mark on his being. Curiosity began to mix with a visceral fear. I felt like an intruder in his world, but the need to understand what was tormenting him led me to ask, "What happened to your family?" But again, the words did not come out. Instead, silence settled between us, and a cold sweat began to break out across my forehead. Daniel lowered his gaze. For an instant, I thought he had shut down completely. But as he looked back toward the horizon, I saw his hands trembling. It was as if the mere mention of his family had unleashed a torrent of repressed memories and emotions. Her breathing became more rapid, and something inside me knew she was on the verge of revelations I had never imagined. In a trembling voice, he began to speak, though there was no audible sound. It was as if the shadows around him were absorbing his words. But in his expression, I saw the torment of years of suffering. Memories seemed to invade him, I could see how his mind traveled to a time when life was simpler, but also darker. As the darkness took over the park, I felt the air grow heavier. The atmosphere was filled with a palpable tension. There was a sense of doom looming over us. Daniel shifted restlessly in his seat as if fighting inner demons that threatened to surface. Finally, his eyes met mine, and I saw an abyss of pain. "I can't keep running away," he seemed to say without uttering a single word. The intensity of her gaze made me feel as if I was looking directly into her soul. In that instant, I knew there was more than just her family and her past. The wind increased its intensity, and the leaves of the trees rustled as if they wanted to warn me of something. Darkness had already fallen completely, and the lights in the park began to flicker, as if the world was about to fade into the gloom. Daniel suddenly stood up, his expression transformed into a mixture of anguish and resolve. "I must face what I left behind," he seemed to say. And in that moment, I understood that I couldn't just let him go like that. Something had trapped him in this darkness. I honestly wanted to run, but a part of me felt compelled to help him. I followed him, not knowing where we were going. We walked down the path, the silence enveloping us like a heavy blanket. Shadows lengthened around us. The park, which had once been a haven, had become a terrifying labyrinth. As we moved on, the feeling that something was wrong grew inside me. We came to a clearing where an old building stood, a weather-worn brick structure. It was a place that had been abandoned for years. Darkness enveloped it. Daniel stopped in front of the entrance, and I saw his body tremble. It was evident that this place meant something to him, something deep and painful. Without thinking, I decided to enter. Darkness enveloped us completely. The air became cold and thick. The light from my phone illuminated the way, revealing a dusty, forgotten interior. The walls were covered in graffiti. The musty smell was overpowering. I felt like time had stopped, and the feeling of claustrophobia increased with every step I took. Daniel stayed close, his gaze fixed on the ground. As we moved forward, he stopped at a closed door. His trembling hand rested on the knob. For a moment, the silence became deafening. Something in his expression made me hesitate, as if he was about to open a Pandora's box. Finally, he gathered his courage and pushed the door. The creaking of the hinges echoed in the air. The room revealed itself before us. Inside, there was a crumbling painting, a dust-covered table, and broken chairs. But what struck me most was a series of photographs on the wall. Images of his family, smiling, happy. What stopped me in my tracks, however, was one image in particular, a photograph that seemed to be marked with a dark shadow. It was the last picture of his family, taken on a radiant day. But in the corner, almost imperceptible, was a dark figure that seemed to be watching. My heart was pounding as I stared at the image. Daniel moved forward and touched the photo with trembling fingers. "They are not at peace," his expression seemed to say. In that moment, I understood that the darkness that had haunted him for years was not just his fault, but that there was something else that haunted him, something that had been trapped in that place. The atmosphere became oppressive, the air charged with an unsettling energy. I felt a shiver run through my body as the room seemed to come alive. Shadows danced around us. Somewhere, a muffled sound echoed like an echo of distant laughter. The tension was palpable, and I realized that we were about to unearth something that had been hidden for too long. Suddenly, the light on my phone flickered and went out, leaving us in the dark. Panic set in, and in the gloom I heard a barely audible whisper, as if the place was talking. "You shouldn't be here," it seemed to say. The voice echoed in my mind. I felt terror wash over me. Daniel turned to me, his eyes filled with indescribable fear. In that instant, I understood that we had awakened something that had lain dormant for years. The darkness had crouched in that place, and we were the intruders. "We must get out," I thought. But before I could say it, the sound of laughter echoed around us. It was childish, joyful laughter, but there was something unsettling about it. The feeling of being watched grew, and the pressure in the air became unbearable. Daniel began to back away, his face pale, and at that moment, I understood that he had to face his past. The darkness that haunted him would not let him go without a fight. As the laughter grew louder, I felt the place close in on us. The dark figure in the photograph seemed to come alive, and the room filled with dancing shadows. Desperation gripped me as I tried to find a way out, but the walls seemed to move, trapping us in a maze of terror. Daniel, with a cry of determination, turned toward the door. "I must face this," he said wordlessly, and with a sudden impulse he ran toward the center of the room. Shadows swirled around him. In that instant, I knew he was about to face the truth he had been running from for years. As he stepped into the darkness, I felt time stand still. Dread came over me. I wanted to follow him, but fear kept me standing still. Laughter turned to screams, and the dark figure approached, as if ready to claim what belonged to him. With a last-ditch effort, I lunged for the door. The darkness enveloped me as I ran, feeling something chasing me. I made it out of the room, the cool air hitting me like a relief, but the echoing screams echoed in my head. Running down the hallway, I headed for the exit. Shadows seemed to follow me, terror clinging to my heels. The light of the park became visible through the door, and with one last push, I stepped outside. I stopped, panting, feeling the cool night air. I looked back, but the door closed behind me, the echo of laughter fading. The darkness seemed to be behind me, but the horror of what I had witnessed was still etched in my mind. As I walked away from the building, I felt the weight of the darkness fade, but not without leaving a mark. Daniel had made the decision to face his past. I didn't know what had happened to him, but I knew his struggle was not over. He had awakened something that could not be ignored. As I left the park, part of me longed to know more, but another part knew there were boundaries I must not cross. Night had fallen, and although the unexpected encounter had revealed dark secrets, it had also left an imprint on my soul. As I walked toward the light of the city, I realized that some secrets should remain hidden, buried in darkness. At dawn, the horror of the previous night was still haunting my mind. I could not stop thinking about Daniel and what I had witnessed. I had awakened something dark in him. I knew I had to act. Confusion and fear turned to cold determination. I had to call the police. With my heart pounding, I dialed the number. When they finally answered, I explained the situation. The words came out of my mouth with difficulty. The operator listened attentively, and after a brief exchange promised to send a unit to the scene. The wait was interminable. Every minute felt like an eternity, as a mixture of anxiety and guilt washed over me. I knew that what I had seen had to be revealed. I could not let the darkness I had encountered remain hidden. I heard sirens in the distance. The sound was getting closer. A wave of relief and fear swept through me. When the agents arrived, I escorted them toward the abandoned building, my mind filled with images of what might await inside. Upon arrival, the place seemed lifeless, as if the previous night had never happened. Yet the tension in the air was palpable. The policemen were cautious, checking every nook and cranny as I followed, unable to take my eyes off the door that had led to the darkness. When we crossed the threshold, the atmosphere became heavy. The agents shone their flashlights on the graffiti and dust-covered walls, and as we moved forward, the feeling of dread intensified. We reached the room where Daniel had confronted his past. It was then that we saw him. Hanging from a rope from the ceiling, Daniel lay in a state that left me petrified. His face, which had once been marked by suffering, now looked peaceful, as if he had finally found a rest that had been denied him for years. But the scene was terrifying, and the air was filled with a sepulchral silence. The policemen, upon realizing the situation, stood transfixed, their faces reflecting disbelief and horror. It wasn't just Daniel's death that shocked them, it was what was around them. Upon further inspection, they found a small hiding place behind a wall where, to their surprise, lay the remains of their family, those who had disappeared years ago. The images of happiness in the photos now contrasted brutally with the macabre reality they discovered. The scene was heartbreaking. The echo of tragedy resounded in the air. The laughter that had once filled that home had been replaced by an oppressive silence. As the agents began to do their work, I stood back, unable to move. The truth that had been hidden for so long had come out, but at a devastating price. Daniel had faced his demons, but the result was a tragic outcome that no one could have foreseen. At that moment, I understood that sometimes the past is not only buried, but comes back in ways we never imagined. The darkness that had enveloped Daniel now loomed over me, reminding me that some secrets are too dark to be revealed. As the cops worked, I felt the weight of the revelation fall on my shoulders, leaving an indelible mark on my soul. The night had begun like any other, but it soon turned into a nightmare. I was alone at home enjoying a book in the half-light of the living room when a subtle noise made me look up. It was a sound that didn't fit the tranquility of home, a dull thud followed by a distant murmur. I ignored it at first, thinking it might be the wind or some animal in the garden. However, when the noise was repeated, this time closer, an uneasy feeling came over me. As the night progressed, the sounds became more frequent and clearer. The thump became a series of thumps, and the murmurs turned into derisive laughter. My heart began to beat faster. At that moment, I understood that I was not alone. Something in my gut told me that these were not just intruders, but a group of criminals looking to break into my home. I got up and went to the window, peering out cautiously. Shadows moved in the garden, dark figures slipping through the trees. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I couldn't stand there exposed. I stepped back and closed the curtains, desperately searching for a plan. The house had several entrances, and I knew I had to make sure each one was securely locked. As I checked the doors and windows, my mind was racing. What did they want? Money? Anything else? The thought that they might be there for more sinister reasons filled me with dread. As I secured each entrance, the sound of pounding intensified. It was as if they knew I was there, that I was watching them. Anxiety gripped me, and my breathing became ragged. Once I was sure all the doors were closed, I headed for the phone. As I picked up the receiver, my heart sank. There was no dial tone. The line was dead, my mind filled with panic. I was completely cut off. Unable to communicate with the outside, the only option was to wait and plan. I decided to move to the back of the house, where there was a small room I used to use as an office. There, I could think more clearly. But as I entered, I realized that it was a dark, enclosed place, and the feeling of claustrophobia began to take hold of me. As I sat in an old chair, I heard the sound of glass breaking. The noise was coming from the front of the house, and terror paralyzed me. I quickly got up and looked out the office window, which overlooked the backyard. The shadows of the criminals were moving desperately, and I could see two of them trying to break in. Their faces were indistinguishable, but the ferocity in their movements was evident. One of them turned suddenly, and although I could not see his eyes, I felt him looking at me, as if he knew I was there, hiding. My mind was trying to find a solution. I had to get out of the house, find a way to escape. But every time I thought about opening a door or a window, the image of those men coming in filled me with terror. I couldn't let that happen. The thought of being captured, of facing the unknown, was too overwhelming. I decided it would be best to find something I could defend myself with. I headed for the kitchen, where there was a chef's knife that I had always kept sharp. As I walked, every creak of the floor seemed to echo like a scream in the darkness. I felt like I was in a horror dream, but I knew I had to stay calm. Reaching the kitchen, I picked up the knife and held it firmly, feeling the cold steel in my hand. With the knife in hand, I returned to the office, where moonlight filtered faintly through the window. I sat in the chair, heart pounding, waiting for the inevitable. I heard mocking laughter and murmurs approaching. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Anxiety had transformed into a kind of determination. I wasn't going to let them catch me without a fight. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang on the front door. It was as if they had decided to force it. My mind filled with images of how this could end. A desperate struggle, a cry for help that would never come. But I refused to give up. I kept silent, listening to every movement. The pounding continued and the door gave way. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the air, and a group of figures entered the house. There were 3 of them, all dressed in black, and although their faces were covered with balaclavas, I could feel the malice they emanated. They moved confidently, as if they knew they were about to get what they wanted. I stood in the shadows of the room, watching them move about the house. One of them began to explore, while the others quickly searched every nook and cranny. I heard them murmuring among themselves, and although I couldn't understand what they were saying, their laughter chilled my blood. The sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. At that moment, I made a decision. I couldn't just stand there waiting for them to find me. I had to act. With knife in hand, I prepared to leave the room. I knew I couldn't let them catch me, so I moved silently toward the door. Opening it slowly, I found myself in the dark hallway. The criminals were at the end, in the living room, searching my belongings. With every step, fear gripped me, but determination kept me moving. If I wanted to get out alive, I had to be cunning. I slipped into the kitchen, where I could see the main entrance. The criminals were too distracted with their looting, and their nonchalance became my advantage. With knife in hand, I prepared for anything, but fear still lurked in my mind. As I moved, a loud bang echoed off the wall. One of the criminals had hit a piece of furniture and knocked something to the floor. His laughter turned into a shout of surprise, and I felt my heart race even faster. I knew I didn't have much time. If I was discovered, I wouldn't stand a chance. Just when I thought I had a chance to escape, one of them turned and started walking toward the kitchen. My instinct told me I had to act. In one swift move, I hid behind one of the kitchen doors, holding the knife in both hands. The criminal entered, looking around disdainfully. I could see his dark figure reflected in the moonlight coming through the window. As his gaze swept around the room, my breathing stopped. In that instant, I knew I had to do something. When his back was turned, I lunged toward him. Steel flashed in the darkness, and in an instant, terror became a brutal struggle. The man spun, startled, and the knife plunged into his side. He screamed, a piercing sound that echoed through the house. Chaos ensued. The other criminals, alerted by the scream, ran into the kitchen. My mind was blank, driven only by the instinct to survive. I pushed the wounded man aside and ran for the back door, feeling time fading away. I couldn't look back, couldn't think about what I had done. As I opened the back door, the cold night greeted me with an icy air. I ran into the garden, feeling the mud under my feet. Adrenaline was driving me, and even though my body cried out for rest, I kept going. I heard shouts behind me, the voice of one of them calling out to his companions. I knew I couldn't stop. I crossed the garden and jumped the fence, landing on the deserted street. The moonlight illuminated the path, and despite the fear that was sweeping through me, freedom was so close. However, the sound of heavy footsteps followed me. I could not afford to look back. I ran, each step faster than the last, my heart pounding in my throat. The flickering lights and shadows became a maze of terror. However, I couldn't stop. The thought of going back to the house, of facing those men, was unacceptable. I had to find shelter. Luckily, I saw a small bar at the end of the street. The light emanating from inside was a beacon in the darkness. Without thinking, I ran to the door and pushed it with all my might. I stepped inside, feeling the warm air and the murmur of conversations that contrasted with the horror I had left behind. The customers looked at me, surprised by my sudden appearance. However, I had no time for explanations. I quickly made my way to the bar, and the bartender, seeing my condition, looked at me with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. But I couldn't answer. The door opened with a bang, and the criminals entered behind me. The bar filled with tension. Stares turned toward them, and their aura of evil was palpable. I felt fear take hold of me again. I was trapped, and although I had managed to escape from the house, I was now in a different trap. The criminals began searching for me, their dark eyes roaming the place. I couldn't stay there, but I couldn't get out either. The bartender, seeing my terror, approached me and told me to hide. He took me to the back of the bar, where there was a small storage room. "Stay here," he told me, and although his voice was calm, I could see the fear in his eyes. I hid behind some boxes, hoping they wouldn't find me. The sound of the criminal's voice echoed through the bar as he demanded to know where the man who had injured his partner was. My mind was spinning about what had happened. I had fought for my life, but now I was in an even more dangerous situation. The shadows of the night enveloped me, and the feeling of despair became overwhelming. I could hear the murmur of conversations, the bartender trying to remain calm as the criminals searched. The tension was palpable, and my heart was pounding. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but I couldn't let them catch me. After what seemed like an eternity, the criminals retreated, frustrated that they hadn't found me. The bartender closed the warehouse door and looked at me with a mixture of relief and concern. "You're safe for now," he said, but his voice carried uncertainty. As I sat on the floor surrounded by boxes, I realized that my struggle was not over. Although I had survived the house, fear and terror still lurked. I was caught between the horror of a night I would never forget and the uncertainty of what would come next. The darkness had come, and although I had found temporary shelter, I knew the siege was not over. Returning to my hometown was always an idea I had avoided, a thought that filled me with discomfort. I had spent years trying to leave behind the echoes of my childhood, the memories of a life I had decided to forget. However, my mother's death forced me to return. The funeral would be held in the home where I grew up, and though my mind resisted, my heart knew I could not miss it. The drive was long and silent. As I drove down the road winding through the trees, I felt a mixture of nostalgia and fear. The landscape had changed little, but my memories filled it with shadows. Every bend, every junction, brought with it fragments of a past I thought buried, images of my childhood friends, of laughter and fights, intertwined with dark moments I would rather forget. Upon arrival, the city presented itself to me as an old acquaintance, but also as a stranger. The streets were decorated with an air of abandonment, as if time had decided to pass me by. The houses, once vibrant, were now worn. Mine stood at the end of the street just as I remembered it, but the garden had grown wild, and the paint on the facade had faded. As I approached, the weight of guilt crushed me. I hadn't been there for years, and returning alone for a funeral made me feel like an intruder. I entered the house, and the air I breathed was suffused with memories. That place had been my refuge and my prison, and now it felt like a mausoleum. The photos on the wall captured moments of happiness that contrasted with the sadness of my present. The next few days passed in a blur of emotions. The funeral was a somber event, where the gazes of the attendees rested on me with a mixture of surprise and disdain. Some of my old friends were there, and though most had changed, their eyes still carried the rancor of years gone by. I had made mistakes in my youth, decisions that had caused more pain than I could imagine. Now, the weight of those decisions was manifesting itself in the palpable tension between us. The night after the funeral, I decided to go for a walk. The city was shrouded in silence, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. As I walked, I remembered the summer evenings I spent in the park, where everything seemed simpler. But that simplicity had been replaced by an air of unease. Something in the atmosphere made me feel watched, as if the shadows were lengthening behind me. I decided to head for the bar I used to visit in my teenage years. It was a place that had been the center of our gatherings, a refuge where laughter and camaraderie filled the air. As I approached, I felt the pulse of the city. The bar lights flickered, and the murmur of conversation invited me in, but also filled me with anxiety. As I walked through the door, the air grew thicker. The music sounded familiar, but the faces of those present were unfamiliar. The decor had changed, but the essence was still intact. I sat in a corner watching the crowd. My old friends were there, though their laughter sounded different, colder. I noticed a few of them looking at me, and the expression on their faces was a reminder that the past did not fade so easily. As I took a drink, the atmosphere became more tense. I could hear snatches of conversation around me, laughter that turned to murmurs. But there was something else, a hidden whisper that seemed to swirl around me. The feeling of being the center of attention intensified, and I couldn't help but wonder if the echoes of my past were about to catch up with me. Suddenly, the door burst open and a group of men entered. Their gazes were cold and full of rancor. I recognized some of them immediately. They were my childhood friends, the ones with whom I had shared so many laughs and secrets. But now their presence was like an approaching storm. The atmosphere in the bar changed. The noise of conversations stopped for an instant, and all eyes turned to them. The group approached the bar, and I couldn't help but feel that time had stopped. The leader, a man who used to be my best friend, looked at me with a mixture of surprise and contempt. His expression was a mixture of emotions, but what struck me most was the look of disappointment that was hidden behind his anger. It was clear that time had not healed the wounds he had caused. As I tried to remain calm, the group began to mutter among themselves. Their gestures were threatening, and the atmosphere became hostile. I felt the air become heavy, and a wave of memories washed over me. I remembered the pledges of loyalty, the shared laughter, and above all, the betrayals that had led to our separation. I decided I had better get out of there before the situation became dangerous. I got up from my chair and headed for the door, but the group blocked my way. The leader smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice filled with a menacing tone. I tried to evade him, but he stepped forward. My hands began to sweat and panic set in. There was no way out of that situation without a confrontation. I looked around, searching for a way out, but all the faces had turned hostile, full of resentment. The leader began to speak, remembering old times, but his words were loaded with irony. He spoke about the promises we had made, about what our friendship had been, and above all, about what I had done to betray them. Each word was like a dagger, and the pain I had tried to forget returned with devastating force. The group laughed, and the sound echoed in my ears. I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. I couldn't stand the pressure, the weight of their stares. Pent-up anger turned to fear, and I realized I couldn't face these men, not at that moment. With an impulse of desperation, I pushed through them and ran for the exit. The night greeted me with cool air, but the terror still haunted me. I didn't know where to go, but I knew I couldn't stay there. The city, which had been my home, now felt like a death trap. I walked aimlessly, seeking refuge in the shadows. The streets were empty, and the rain began to fall again, washing the ground as my thoughts raged in my mind. I felt cornered, like a wounded animal. Echoes of my old friends echoed in my head, and each memory felt like a heavy burden. Then I reached the park where I had spent so many happy moments of my childhood. The lantern lights flickered dimly, and the sound of the wind through the trees was a familiar whisper. I sat on a bench feeling the fear slowly begin to fade, but the calm was short-lived. As I tried to compose myself, I felt a presence. I looked back and saw figures approaching. It was the men from the bar, their silhouettes dark and menacing. My heart stopped. I was trapped again. I stood up, but one raised a hand, stopping me. At that moment, I understood that I could not escape the ghosts of my past. Facing my mistakes again was inevitable. Every action had had consequences, and now I had to deal with them. As the rain fell harder, I found myself standing at the crossroads of my life. The city, with its shadows and memories, was no longer the refuge it had been. It was a maze of unhappiness and resentment. I felt the weight of the past dragging me down into darkness, and the only way to free myself was to face it head-on. The man came closer, and although his gaze was hard, there was something else, a sadness that reflected the impact of our shared decisions. In that instant, I understood that the only way to close the cycle was to reconnect with those I had hurt. With my heart pounding, I decided it was time to be completely honest. I looked him in the face and began to speak. "There is something I must confess," I said, feeling the weight of each word. "The reason we grew apart was because of my betrayal. When that incident happened, when you were involved in the robbery, I was afraid. Instead of supporting you, I went to the police and ratted you out." The words came out of my mouth like a poison that had been hidden for years. I remembered that moment, the pressure I felt and the urge to protect myself, to save my skin at the expense of my friends. My actions had been impulsive, but the consequences were devastating. They spent years in jail while I walked away from the city carrying a guilt that had haunted me ever since. The silence was palpable. The looks on my friends' faces were a mixture of anger and pain. I watched as some of them clenched their fists, remembering the suffering they had endured because of my betrayal. I didn't know how much damage I was causing, I continued, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. I left thinking that time would erase what I had done, but it didn't. The leader of the group, the one who had been closest to me, finally broke the silence. "What you did hurt us in a way we can't forget. We spent years in prison for an act that you were a part of. And while we understand that you were afraid, that doesn't change the fact that you betrayed our trust." That night, as the rain came down hard, I felt like I was on the verge of losing my life. The confrontation had been just a storm I could not have anticipated. My former friends, those I had once considered brothers, had made it clear that there was no longer a place for me in their world. They gave me until morning to get out of town, warning me that if I didn't, the consequences would be dire. I walked through the soggy streets, each step echoing in my mind like an echo of my failures. I felt defeated, not only because of the fear that was invading me, but also because of the deep loneliness that enveloped me. Those who had been a fundamental part of my life, those who had once shared laughter and secrets, were now only shadows of a past I had destroyed. As I walked aimlessly, the city felt alien. The flickering lights and distant sounds seemed to taunt me, reminding me that I had lost my place in this world. I couldn't help but think about what I had been and what I had let fall. The betrayal I had committed had not only shattered the lives of my friends, but had also sealed my fate. The rain fell mercilessly, transforming the streets into dark rivers that meandered under the dim light of the street lamps. I walked alone, my coat soaking wet and my shoes full of puddles, trying to find shelter in a world that seemed to vanish in the mist. The night was especially dark. The loneliness felt like a weight in the air. As I made my way down a lonely street, the sound of my footsteps mingled with the soft murmur of the rain. Each falling drop seemed to amplify the silence around me, creating an atmosphere of tension that set my nerves on edge. It was one of those nights when fear lurked around every corner. The thought of being seen or heard became a constant worry. As I turned a corner, my attention was caught by a strange movement at the end of the street. Through the curtain of water, I glimpsed a figure. At first I thought it might be a reflection of my own shadow, but as I got closer, I could make out a woman. She was standing, hugging herself, shivering with cold or perhaps fear. I couldn't see her face, but there was something about her posture that unsettled me. I decided to approach, feeling a mixture of curiosity and concern. The woman seemed lost, looking around as if waiting for someone. In an instant, that feeling of unease turned to alarm. A dark car with no lights on pulled up beside her and a male figure emerged from inside. The rain obscured the details, but the tension in the air was palpable. My heart was pounding as I watched from the shadows. The scene was unfolding in slow motion. I watched as the man approached the woman, his gestures sharp and determined. She stepped back, but he grabbed her arm tightly. At that moment, I understood that I was witnessing a kidnapping. The instinct in me struggled between the desire to help and the fear of becoming a victim. I knew I had to act, but the rain and darkness created a veil that kept me safe in my hiding place. The woman struggled, but her screams were drowned out by the roar of the storm. Desperation gripped me as the man dragged her toward the car. I looked around, searching for something I could use. I didn't have a phone handy. My only recourse was darkness and silence. The rain seemed to be my ally, a cloak that hid my movements. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the adrenaline that invaded me. If I was going to intervene, I had to do it with cunning. The car, a black sedan, had the windows fogged up and the lights off. The figure of the man was moving fast, almost as if he knew that time was against him. The woman, struggling with all her might, seemed to be losing the battle. Her fear was palpable. That pushed me out of my hiding place. I slipped in the rain, feeling the water soaking my skin. Each step felt like an act of bravery, but also of madness. The distance between me and the car shortened, the sound of the engine roaring like a monster in the dark. The man finally opened the back door and, with a sudden movement, pushed the woman into the vehicle. In that instant, anger and fear came together in a whirlwind of emotions. I knew I could not stand idly by. I searched inside my mind for some strategy, something that could help me intervene without being discovered. I looked around. There was an overturned dumpster nearby, and an idea began to take shape. With silent movements, I approached the dumpster and tipped it over, creating a rumble that echoed in the night. The man stopped immediately, turning his head in my direction. The woman, still inside the car, let out a small scream. My heart stopped for a moment. I had managed to get her attention, but at a cost. The man stepped out of the car, his dark figure cut out against the rain. His fierce gaze searched the surroundings, and his menacing stance made me back away. It was a huge risk, but I knew I couldn't let it end like this. The woman needed help, and I was too close to turn around. With a determined move, I hid behind a nearby tree, watching every move. The man began to approach, his attitude aggressive and his gaze full of fury. Fear invaded me, but at the same time, determination filled my chest. I could not let this situation be consummated. As the man approached, I noticed a shiny object on the ground. It was a small brick, probably fallen from some nearby construction site. Without a second thought, I picked it up and with all my might threw it toward the car. The brick hit with a thud, and the sound echoed in the night like a scream. The man stopped, confused, and turned his head toward the car. That was the moment I needed. Wasting no time, I ran to the woman, who was trapped in the back of the vehicle. I threw open the door with force, and she, wild-eyed, looked at me in disbelief. "Get out!" I shouted at her. But she didn't move. The man, realizing that someone else had intervened, turned his attention back to me, and his expression became even more menacing. The woman finally reacted and got out of the car. At that moment, the man made a sudden move toward me. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I braced myself for what was to come. I knew I had to act fast. With a twist, I pushed the woman to the side and positioned myself between her and the man. The kidnapper lunged at me. We were in a frantic struggle. His hands were like iron, and his strength was terrifying. The rain poured down on us, slipping on our skins, but the fight didn't stop. I felt her fist strike me in the side, and the pain shot through me, but I could not give up. As we struggled, the woman to the side seemed paralyzed, not knowing whether she should help me or run. The rain continued to fall, and in the midst of that confusion, I managed to break free for an instant. With a gasp, I gained momentum and pushed him toward the car. He stumbled, momentarily disoriented. "Run!" I shouted, and he seemed to react. She took a step back and, seeing the man recover, began to run. I watched her disappear into the darkness, and a part of me was relieved. but the danger had not yet passed. The man turned quickly toward me with uncontrollable fury. His gaze was one of rage that chilled my blood. Without thinking, I picked up the brick I had picked up earlier and with all my might hurled it towards his face. The impact was brutal. His head tilted to one side. He stopped, stunned. I seized the moment and ran in the opposite direction of the woman, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I couldn't just stand there. I felt the rain pushing me forward. The darkness thickened around me, but I couldn't let fear overpower me. As I ran, my thoughts raged. Had I managed to save her? How could I have gotten involved in something so dangerous? But deep down, I knew I couldn't just sit idly by. This woman's life was at stake. Danger was lurking. I had made the right decision to act. Turning a corner, I stopped to catch my breath, but I knew the man could be behind me. I couldn't waste any time. I had to find a safe place. As I looked around, I saw a small cafe that still had its lights on. Without hesitation, I ran to the entrance and pushed open the door. The sound of chimes echoed in the air. The few customers looked at me curiously. However, I had no time for explanations. I quickly made my way to the counter where the barista watched me with concern. "Call the police," I shouted to her. She nodded and started dialing the number. Meanwhile, I turned to the window trying to catch a glimpse if the man was following me. I couldn't stand still. I looked around, looking for some way to make sure the man didn't come in. I could see the reflection of my eyes in the glass, the terror in them making me feel vulnerable. Finally, the barista ended the call and quickly approached me. "The police are on their way," she told me, her voice shaky. I was grateful for her help, but my mind was still focused on the woman. Would she be safe? Had she managed to escape? After a few minutes that felt like hours, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. A sense of relief washed over me, but I knew the situation was still dangerous. The police arrived quickly. Several officers entered the cafe, their imposing presence filling the place. I explained to them what had happened, feeling the words running over in my mouth. I talked about the woman, the man, the kidnapping. Every detail seemed crucial, and as I spoke, anxiety grew inside me. The police went out in search of the woman and the man, but time was getting thicker and thicker. One of the officers returned, his face grave. "We have found the woman. She's safe," he reported, and a wave of relief swept through me. But the next comment chilled my blood. "However, the man managed to escape. We are trying to locate him." Fear gripped me again. I knew I was not out of danger. The thought that this man might be on the loose, seeking revenge, filled me with trepidation. But at least I had done the right thing by intervening. The woman was safe. I sat at a table in the cafe, shaking from the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. The night had been a nightmare, but in the midst of it all, I had managed to save someone. But the feeling that the horror could still return never left me. The rain was falling heavily that afternoon, an incessant torrent that seemed to want to drown the city. The streets were deserted, the heavy atmosphere mixed with the smell of wet earth and asphalt. I had agreed to interview an ex-convict, a man named Raul, who had spent years behind bars for a crime that still resonated in the collective memory of the community. It was a case that had always captured my attention as a journalist, and now I finally had the opportunity to hear his side of the story. The place chosen for the interview was a small cafe in a forgotten neighborhood, a place that had seen better days. The windows were fogged up and the dim light created a gloomy atmosphere. I sat at a table in the corner while the rain pounded hard on the glass, creating a backdrop that added to the tension of the situation. When Raul arrived, I saw him through the window. He was a middle-aged man with a face marked by time and experience, and a look that seemed to carry the weight of his history. He approached the table with slow steps. Despite his calm appearance, there was something unsettling about his presence. He offered me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I knew immediately that the conversation would not be easy. As we began the interview, the rain continued to fall and the sound became a constant accompaniment to our words. Raul spoke with an unsettling calmness, recounting his life and the events that had led him to prison. His voice was deep, almost hypnotic, and as he spoke, I felt the atmosphere grow thicker. He spoke of his childhood, of the decisions that led him down a dark path. But what intrigued me most was the crime for which he had been convicted, a brutal murder that had left the community in shock. As he narrated his story, the mood grew darker and the sky reflected the tension growing between us. As the conversation progressed, Raoul began to delve into the details of the crime. His account was graphic and chilling. He spoke of the victim, a young woman whose life had been violently cut short. His words were imbued with a coldness that chilled my blood. Although he seemed to speak of a distant event, there was a spark of emotion in his voice, a glint in his eyes that I could not ignore. The cafe was almost empty. The atmosphere became oppressive, a sense of discomfort came over me. Every time Raoul talked about his past, I could feel the tension building in the air, as if something dark was lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Suddenly his tone changed. "What no one knows," he said, "is that it wasn't an accident. I planned the whole thing." The coldness in his voice was eerie. I thought of the young woman whose life had been taken, and the possibility that Raoul might be enjoying every word he spoke. My journalistic instinct told me I should keep asking, but fear was beginning to infiltrate my mind. The sense of danger was becoming more real with every word that left his lips. As he continued to speak, Raoul began to describe the moments leading up to the crime, his thoughts, his emotions. It was as if he was reliving the experience. Every detail he shared made me feel more caught up in his story. There was something hypnotic in his storytelling, but also terrifying. I wondered if there was something more than simple storytelling in his voice, as if he was looking for a connection, as if through my attention he could relive the moment. As the rain continued to fall, the conversation turned to life after prison. Raoul spoke of his freedom, but his eyes reflected a darkness I couldn't ignore. "People think prison changes people," he said, and his tone turned somber. It was then that unease turned to dread. A sense that something was about to happen began to take hold of me. The atmosphere in the cafe was becoming denser and denser. The air was charged with palpable tension. I looked around, searching for some distraction, but the cafe seemed to be trapped in a bubble of silence. Raoul continued, his words beginning to reverberate in my mind. "There are always consequences, you know. Sometimes people don't realize that there are those who still seek revenge." His gaze fixed on me, and immediately a shiver ran down my spine. For an instant, I felt as if the rain had stopped being just water and had become a symbol of the storm that was lurking. The conversation became even more disturbing when Raoul began to talk about those who had betrayed him, those who had tried to bring him down. His words were imbued with a resentment that chilled me to the bone. He spoke of a debt that needed to be paid off, of a cycle that never closed. I couldn't help but feel that I was at the center of something much bigger. Raoul's revelation made me question my own safety. How far was he willing to go to protect me? As the ex-convict continued to speak, a terrifying thought crossed my mind. What if he was talking about me? He leaned forward, his face only inches from mine. "The shadows never go away, my friend. There's always someone who wants to claim them," he whispered. But the way he said it filled me with a deep discomfort. The lights in the cafe flickered at that moment, and the tension peaked. I felt the air become unbreathable, as if the walls were closing in around me. The thought that I might be Raoul's next target terrified me. Why was he saying this to me? What did he really know about my life? In a moment, the door to the cafe opened, the cold wind bringing with it a rush of water. A man walked in, drenched and visibly upset. He looked around, and his gaze fixed on Raoul. The tension in the air became electric. The new visitor approached our table. It was evident that there was something between them, something dark that I could not understand. The atmosphere became oppressive, and a sense of danger came over me like a shadow. As the man spoke to Raoul in a barely audible whisper, my mind raced a mile a minute. I felt an omen, a warning that something terrible was about to happen. I thought the situation was becoming uncontrollable, and the idea of being a spectator in this macabre game filled me with terror. The man made a gesture towards me, and at that instant everything stopped. Raoul looked at him. The tension became palpable. It was as if time had stopped, and the rain became the only sound in the cafe. My heart was pounding as discomfort built up in my chest. Without warning, Raoul rose from his chair, his gaze fixed on me. "Sometimes one cannot escape one's fate," he said, and his words echoed in my mind like a terrifying echo. The sense of danger intensified, and I knew I had to act. With a swift movement, I stood up and headed for the exit. The rain hit me on my way out, but I didn't stop. I ran down the sidewalk, feeling the water soaking my clothes. The sound of my footsteps mingled with the noise of the storm, and adrenaline coursed through my veins. My mind was in chaos. What had I discovered? What were the implications of all this for me? The feeling of being chased gripped me. Every shadow that moved in the darkness seemed to come to life. The cold enveloped me, but I couldn't stop. I ran aimlessly, trying to put distance. I knew Raul wouldn't stop. There was something in his gaze that told me he wasn't just an ex-convict. There was something more sinister inside him. Then, I found refuge in an abandoned building. I quickly entered, closing the door behind me. The silence was overwhelming, and the rain was still pounding on the roof like a drum. I let myself slump against the wall, trying to catch my breath and calm the agitation that overcame me. As I sat in the darkness, my thoughts turned to the conversation I had had with Raul. The revelation of his intentions, the look on his face, all intertwined in a whirlwind of terror. What could I do now? The police wouldn't be able to help me. The fear of being a target gripped my every thought. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in my thoughts. But suddenly, a noise brought me out of my reverie. A dull thud echoed on the door, and my heart skipped a beat. I knew someone was trying to get in. Adrenaline came flooding back as I searched for a place to hide. I slid behind an old dust-covered couch, trying to hold my breath. The pounding got louder. My mind was racing a mile a minute, and the thought of Raul being behind that door filled me with dread. How had he gotten here? What did he want from me? The final blow made the door give way, and the figure of a man slipped inside. The rain had soaked him, and his silhouette was silhouetted against the darkness. My heart stopped for a moment as I watched him, unable to move. It was Raul. The tension in the air became unbearable. I couldn't believe he was there, in that place, after everything that had happened. His gaze was cold and calculating. His smile was a macabre grimace. He had managed to find me, and now I was trapped. Obviously, panic gripped me, but I knew I had to stay calm. Raul moved slowly, his gaze sweeping the room. He was like a predator stalking his prey, and I was the victim. Finally, he stopped in front of the couch where I was hiding. His breathing was heavy. The darkness enveloped him like a cloak. The tension was becoming unbearable, and I knew I had to act. With a quick movement, I darted to the side, trying to create a distraction. The rain was still falling outside, and the sound became a scream of horror. Raul turned to me, in that instant, his gaze filled with fury. "You thought you could escape," he said, his voice low and menacing. The darkness of the place became oppressive. His figure slowly approached. The sense of danger intensified, but I knew I had to find a way out. With a swift movement, I ran to the back door of the building. The rain greeted me like a cold embrace, and I felt that freedom was only a few steps away. But Raul was behind me, and his laughter echoed in the darkness. I couldn't let him catch me. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I ran toward the street. I ran without looking back, feeling the fear take hold of me. I knew I had to get out of that nightmare, that I had to find a safe place. The city was full of shadows, and the echo of my footsteps echoed in the darkness. Finally, I came to a brighter street where the lights of the cars shone like headlights in the storm. The rain beat against my face, but I couldn't stop. I looked back and saw Raul's figure fade into the distance. I had managed to escape, at least for now. The terror of that night would haunt me for a long time. Although I had survived, I knew that Raul's shadow would always be behind me. The rain had washed away the fear, but it had left an indelible mark on my soul. As I walked away, I realized that the past is never forgotten. The storm had passed, but the echo of darkness would continue to resonate in my life. I had witnessed the shadow of a man, and now I knew I could not escape its consequences. The rain continued to fall, and with it the certainty that life would never be the same again. My brother Edward had disappeared 3 weeks ago, and the silence that had enveloped his absence had become an unbearable burden. The last time I saw him, he was in a sea of worries, talking about a new opportunity that had caught him in its nets. I never imagined those words meant anything so dark. Days turned into nights, and nights into a whirlwind of memories. Every corner of his apartment spoke to me of him. The coffee cups still on the table, the untidy clothes, the books stacked unread. Friends and family said to leave him, that maybe he needed some time alone. But I knew something wasn't right. That intuition led me to search for answers. I began my inquiries in the neighborhood where he lived. It had been a while since I had seen it, and the air was permeated with a musty, desperate smell. The streets were deserted. The rain transformed the pavement into a distorted mirror. I asked a few acquaintances, but they all seemed fearful, as if talking about Edouard was taboo. One man, with a furtive gesture, mentioned something about a group meeting in an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. The words echoed in my mind. I knew I had to go. The warehouse was a dilapidated structure, with broken windows and rusted metal doors. The wind howled like a whale. With each step I took toward the place, a mixture of fear and determination grew in my chest. I knew I was about to cross a line, but the need to find my brother was stronger than any fear. As I approached, I noticed flickering lights through the cracks in the walls. Music thundered through the air, a sound that seemed to vibrate with a dark energy. I paused for a moment, my heart pounding, before pushing open the door. The screech of metal echoed like a scream in the night. Upon entering, the atmosphere changed drastically. The interior was crowded with people, all immersed in a world I didn't understand. The music was deafening, and the faces of the attendees were masks of euphoria and despair. The atmosphere was thick, as if darkness had taken over every corner. I looked around, searching for Edouard, but instead I found empty stares, bodies moving to the rhythm of a restrained madness. I began to make my way through the crowd, each step filled with uncertainty. I didn't know what I was looking for, but the feeling that I was in the right place pushed me forward. I approached a corner where a group of people were congregating, their laughter and shouts echoing in the air. I watched carefully, and then I saw something that chilled my blood. In the center, a man was talking fervently, gesturing with his hands. His eyes were shining with a disturbing intensity, and his voice was a hypnotic chant that drew everyone in. There was something about his presence that made me uncomfortable, an aura of danger that hung over him. All around him, the crowd seemed enraptured, as if they were under a spell. Suddenly, in the midst of the confusion, I saw a figure that looked familiar. It was Edouard. His face was illuminated by the flickering light. Although he seemed to be enjoying the moment, there was something in his gaze that filled me with unease. The euphoria that surrounded him was not the same as I knew. There was a deep emptiness in him, as if he had sold his soul in exchange for that experience. Without thinking, I decided to approach. My heart was pounding as I made my way through the crowd. The music boomed in my ears, and every time I tried to get his attention, I got lost in the noise. Finally, I made it to his side. I called out to him silently, but he didn't hear me. He was trapped in some kind of trance. I watched as the man in the center of the group continued to speak, and his speech became increasingly somber. He spoke of power, of freedom through surrender, and of a place where worries and pain disappeared. The crowd responded with cheers, and the atmosphere grew thicker and thicker. I realized that what they were looking for was not just fun. There was something darker behind it all. The sense of urgency overwhelmed me. I couldn't let Edouard sink deeper into this madness. I grabbed his arm and shook him gently. At last, his eyes fixed on me, but there was no recognition in his gaze. It was as if he didn't know who I was. His expression was a mixture of confusion and disdain, and it terrified me. "Edouard, we have to go," I whispered. But in that instant, the man in the center noticed our interaction. His gaze turned cold, and an awkward silence took over. The crowd turned toward us, and I felt the pressure building. The music faded, and the atmosphere became threatening. The man approached, his presence overwhelming. "What are you doing here?" he asked, and his look said it all. He had crossed a line. He was now exposed to something he didn't fully understand. The group began to move towards us. The sense of danger was palpable. Edouard was still looking at me with confusion, and his expression tore at my heart. I couldn't let them catch him. With a shove, I pulled him toward the exit. The crowd swarmed around us, and the air became heavy. We made it out of the warehouse, where the rain was still coming down hard. Darkness enveloped us, and we ran toward the street, but the feeling of being chased intensified. The city lights flickered, and the sound of our footsteps mingled with the rumbling of the storm. I didn't know if we were safe, and fear gripped me. Edouard seemed disoriented, and although we were running, his mind seemed to be trapped somewhere else. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, looked into his eyes. "Edouard, wake up, you can't stay there, we have to go back home," I shouted at him. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed behind us. The crowd from the warehouse had come out to look for us. The man who had been in the center was leading the charge, and his look was a mixture of fury and determination. The rain poured down like a blanket of despair as we hurried for shelter. Not knowing where to go, I ran into a dark alley. The rain was coming down hard, and the sound became a warning chant. The feeling of being hunted filled me with terror. We hid behind some garbage cans, and my heart was pounding. Darkness was our only ally, but danger still lurked. As we hid, I looked at Edouard. His face was drenched, confusion still reigned in his eyes. "What happened to you?" I asked him. But I knew I couldn't expect a coherent answer. He was trapped in a world he didn't understand. I had to find a way to get him out of it. The footsteps were getting closer. The tension was becoming unbearable. The man had reached the alley, and his figure was silhouetted against the rain. I could feel his gaze fixed on us, and fear paralyzed me. "We can't stay here," I muttered, and Edouard nodded slightly, as if finally beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. With a last glance, we decided to run in the opposite direction. The rain was lashing down on us, but there was no time to think. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins as we ran deeper into the shadows of the city. Every step we took us away from the madness of the warehouse, but danger still lurked. We ran aimlessly, searching for safety. The streets were deserted, and the sound of the rain became an echo of our desperation. In a moment of clarity, I remembered an old friend who could help us, someone who had had connections with the police. Maybe he could give us a way out. We arrived at his apartment, a building in a quieter neighborhood. As we climbed the stairs, anxiety consumed me. I slammed the door hard, my heart pounding in my chest. After a few moments that felt eternal, I heard the sound of footsteps. The door opened, and there stood Miguel, with an expression of surprise and concern on his face. Without wasting any time, we stepped inside and closed the door behind us. Miguel noticed the tension in the air, and his gaze stopped on Edouard. "What happened?" he asked, but there was no time for explanations. I quickly told him what had happened: the meeting in the warehouse, the presence of that man, and the need to protect Edouard. Miguel became serious. "You have to tell me everything. What you have seen could be dangerous," he warned, and his tone carried a weight I could not ignore. As he spoke, I felt the rain continue to fall outside, like an echo of the storm that loomed over us. After explaining everything, Miguel started asking questions, trying to gather the necessary information. Edouard sat on the couch, staring blankly, and I could see that reality was beginning to seep into his mind. "I can't stay here," he said suddenly, his voice trembling. "They have to find me." The desperation in his voice filled me with anguish. "You can't let them get you again." "We must stay away from them," I replied. But I knew the fight for his mind was just beginning. The shadow of what he had experienced still had him trapped, and the battle would not be easy. Miguel began making calls, seeking help and trying to establish a plan. Meanwhile, the rain continued to fall, and the sound became a warning chant. The feeling that something was about to happen filled me with trepidation. I could not let Edouard become one more victim of this darkness. Finally, Miguel hung up the phone and turned to us. "I've spoken to someone who can help us, but we need to get out of here before it's too late," he said, and his look was serious. The rain was still pounding on the glass, and the wind was howling like a whale. Without hesitation, we set off. The rain had become a torrent, and the air was thick with the threat of the unknown. We left the building and ran to Miguel's car. The night was dark, and the feeling of being chased grew more intense. As we drove, the rain continued to fall, and the sound became an echo of our desperation. Edouard looked out the window, and I could see that confusion still reigned in his mind. The fight for his freedom was not over, and I knew I had to protect him at all costs. Finally, we reached a safe place. It was an apartment in a remote neighborhood, a refuge where we could hide for a while. Miguel took us inside, and the atmosphere became calmer. But worry still lurked in the air. The rain was still falling, and the sound became a warning chant. As we settled down, I looked at Edouard. His face was drenched, but there was something else in his gaze. The confusion had begun to fade, and the reality of what had happened was beginning to seep in. "I'm sorry," she murmured, and her voice was full of regret. "I didn't mean for this to happen." The storm outside was still raging, but I knew we had managed to escape, at least for now. The struggle to retrieve Edouard and protect him from the shadows that stalked him was far from over. As the rain continued to fall, I realized that the search for the truth was just beginning. and the shadows of the past would always be present, reminding us that danger never fully recedes. The city air was permeated with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness when I arrived at the cafe where I had agreed to meet. It was a cool night. I'd been looking forward to this blind date for days, a chance to get out of my routine and perhaps meet someone special. However, as I approached the cafe, an uneasy feeling began to rise in my chest. The place had a cozy atmosphere, with dark wooden tables and dim lights that created a warm halo. As I entered, the sound of lively conversations and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee enveloped me. However, as my eyes adjusted to the light, I noticed something wasn't right. It was as if the atmosphere was charged with an unheard-of tension. I looked around, searching for the person I had been in contact with. The idea that he might be in front of me, about to meet someone interesting, filled me with excitement, but that excitement quickly faded. Most of the tables were occupied, but no figure looked familiar. I pulled out my phone, checking messages for one last hint of her arrival. Nothing. The screen lit up, but only the reflection of my own anxiety stared back at me. I decided to take a seat at a corner table, a place where I could observe without being observed. I ordered a coffee, trying to calm my nerves. As I waited, my eyes moved around the premises, looking for any sign that she was nearby. It was then that I saw her. A woman was sitting at a table in the back. Her dark hair fell in waves over her shoulders, and her face was partially hidden by shadow. Although I couldn't see her features clearly, there was something about her posture that I found intriguing. Her gaze, fixed on a distant point, seemed to be lost in deep thought. Yet there was something about her that unsettled me, a sadness that seemed to go beyond the superficial. I couldn't help but be curious. It was her. It could be the person I had been talking to. Uncertainty invaded me, but an inexplicable force urged me to approach. I stood up, leaving my half-finished coffee, and walked toward her table. When I arrived, the woman looked up. Her eyes were a deep color, but there was an emptiness in them that made me hesitate. Without a word, I sat down across from her, feeling like I was crossing a boundary I couldn't see. The words did not flow as I had hoped. Instead of a warm greeting, an awkward silence settled between us, like a dense fog that made communication difficult. The woman continued to stare at me, and although her gaze was penetrating, there was something unsettling about it. It was as if she was sizing me up, trying to discern something in me that even I didn't know. I tried to break the ice, asking if she would like to order something, but there was no response. His gaze drifted to the window as if he was waiting for someone else. That action filled me with a strange sense of unease. The idea that he might be waiting for someone else made me feel like an intruder. Time passed slowly. The coffee I had ordered arrived, but there was no way to break the ice. The conversation I had anticipated had turned into a game of blank stares and awkward moments. Every time I tried to initiate small talk, she would respond with a subtle gesture, as if she was more interested in her own thoughts than in my presence. I felt the air grow thicker, and the light in the cafe seemed to lose its warmth. As I looked around, I noticed that the other diners seemed oblivious to the tension that had taken over our table. Some laughed, others spoke in low tones, but in my world, there was only an overwhelming silence. I decided it was time to face the situation. I asked if he was okay and instantly felt stupid. The question was absurd in the context of what was happening. His gaze focused on me again, and for a moment I thought I saw a spark of recognition, as if he was finally seeing me. But that spark faded as quickly as it had come. It was just that I hadn't expected this. It echoed in my mind like a whisper that seemed to come from somewhere deep and dark. The uneasy feeling grew, and the air seemed to grow colder. I tried to change the course of the conversation, asking what he liked to do in his free time, hoping that might open a path. However, his response was an even deeper silence. Discomfort turned into a knot in my stomach. As time progressed, the atmosphere in the cafe became increasingly strange. I began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. Shadows in the corners seemed to move, and the murmur of conversations faded, as if reality itself was dissolving. The woman in front of me began to reflect these changes. Her face, once enigmatic, now seemed paler, as if a life that once filled it was fading. Maybe I should leave, I thought, but something stopped me. The thought of leaving her there in that sort of limbo filled me with worry. There was something in her gaze that told me she wasn't well, that there was more to her than met the eye. On impulse, I reached out my hand to her, trying to make a connection. But at that moment, the woman leaned back, her eyes wide open, and I saw her expression transform. It was a subtle change, but a gleam appeared in her eyes that I had not seen before. It was as if in that instant something inside her had awakened. "Why don't you speak?" I asked in my mind. But before I could process my thoughts, the atmosphere changed again. The lights in the cafe flickered, and a shiver ran through my body. The woman looked at me again, and this time her gaze was intense, as if she was trying to communicate without words. Suddenly, the cafe fell silent. The murmuring ceased, and the sound of cups and plates stopped. It was as if time had stopped, and all eyes in the room were fixed on us. Discomfort turned to terror. The woman leaned toward me, her face so close to mine that I could feel her cold breath. "I'm trapped," she said. "I can't get out of here." The desperation in her expression was palpable, and fear gripped me. Without knowing why, I suddenly understood that this blind date was a much darker game than I had imagined. The woman was not simply someone lost in thought. She was trapped in a cycle from which she could not escape. The idea that reality around me might be collapsing became terrifying. The cafe, once a meeting place, now became a prison of shadows and whispers. I must go, I thought, but my legs did not respond. I was paralyzed by a fear I could not explain. At that moment, the woman extended her hand toward me, and the light from the cafe seemed to darken even more. I felt an invisible force holding me in place. The shadows began to lengthen, and the air became unbreathable. The woman smiled, but it was not a smile of relief, it was a smile of resignation. In an instant, the coffee vanished, and all that remained was darkness. Shadows surrounded me, and her laughter, a distant echo, echoed in my mind. I awoke suddenly, my heart pounding. I was sitting in the cafe, but now everything felt different. People were still talking, oblivious to what had happened. I looked around, and the woman was gone. Her absence left an emptiness on the table in front of me, a reminder that there was something more to this date that I didn't understand. I looked out the window and saw that night had fallen completely. Moonlight illuminated the street, and for a moment I felt that all was calm. But in the back of my mind, the feeling that something was not right persisted. I stood up quickly, feeling that I had to get out of that place, that I couldn't stay a second longer. As I left, the cold air hit me in the face, and the silence of the night overcame me. I began to walk aimlessly, searching for answers in the darkness. The streets were deserted, and each step echoed in my mind like an echo of what I had left behind. The feeling that something was following me intensified, and fear clung to me like a shadow. Finally, I came to an empty park. Lights twinkled in the distance, but there was no one in sight. I sat down on a bench, trying to regain my composure, but the image of the woman was still in my mind, her expression of despair and the echo of her trapped voice echoing in my thoughts. The night grew darker, and the air grew thick. I felt something moving in the shadows, and unease turned to panic. It was as if reality was fracturing around me, and a dark world would begin to seep through the cracks. I stood up abruptly, determined to get back to the cafe. I had to find answers, to understand what had happened. When I returned, the place was as I had left it, as if nothing had changed. But I knew that everything had changed. I went back inside, and the feeling of being watched intensified. The stares of the customers were on me as if they knew something I didn't. I looked for the table where I had been. But it was empty. The woman had disappeared, and with her, any trace of normalcy that might have existed. Suddenly, the cafe went dark, the lights flickered, and the murmur of conversation faded. In an instant, I was once again surrounded by shadows, and the woman appeared in front of me again, her face shadowed. "Why won't you help me?" echoed in my mind, though I could not hear her words. The desperation in her eyes was palpable, and terror enveloped me. I felt as if I were caught between two worlds, as if I belonged to neither. I tried to move toward her, but an invisible force stopped me. Shadows began to creep toward me, and her laughter echoed around me, an echo of madness and despair. The cafe, which had been a refuge, had now been transformed into a labyrinth of horror. "Help me," echoed in my mind, and at that moment I understood that the blind date had not been a chance encounter. It had been a call, a warning that I was about to cross a line I should not have crossed. The woman smiled once again, but this time it was a smile of resignation. Shadows swirled around her, and the darkness expanded like a cloak. In a last attempt, I tried to reach her, but the void caught me, and in an instant, everything vanished. I woke up again, this time on the street, surrounded by the calm of the night. Reality hit me like a bolt of lightning. The date, the woman, the coffee. It had all been a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. But deep inside me, I knew it hadn't been just that. There was something else, something I had left behind that I could never get back. The cold air enveloped me as I walked. The shadows lengthened at my sides, and the echo of his voice echoed in my mind. "Why won't you help me?" In that moment, I understood that the blind date had been just the beginning of something darker. A reminder that sometimes what appears to be a simple encounter can drag us into an abyss from which there is no return. The uncertainty of what I had experienced haunted my every step, and as the night closed in around me, I knew I could never escape the shadows I had awakened. It was an ordinary day when I received a message on my phone. At first, I didn't pay attention. It was an unknown number. But when I saw the name that appeared on the screen, my heart skipped a beat. It was Andres, my old schoolmate, someone I hadn't seen in over a decade. The memory hit me like a bolt of lightning. The last day I had seen him had been the darkest day of my life. Andrew and I were friends in school, but friendship turned to rivalry. He was a bright kid with a natural talent for math and a smile that could light up any room. On the other hand, I was average, a kid who was always one step behind him. Over time, envy took hold of me. I remember how I felt when, at our last math competition, my jealousy led me to do something horrible. I left a practical joke in his locker, something I should never have done. The humiliation he suffered was profound, and although I tried to apologize, he never accepted it. From that day on, he became a stranger, a slowly fading shadow in my life. Andrew's message was brief, but its content chilled my blood. He had written that he was back and that it was time for me to pay for what I did. My hands trembled as I read those words. I couldn't believe that after so many years the past would come back to haunt me. That night, anxiety kept me awake. I mentally scoured every corner of my memory, trying to recall the moments we shared, those that were once happy. I remembered her laughter, her way of lighting up the classroom, but also the sadness in her eyes on the day of the prank. Guilt consumed me. I knew I couldn't ignore what I had done. The thought that Andrew was planning something filled me with dread. The next day, I decided I had to do something. I went to the police, but when I explained the situation, they just laughed at me. They told me it was just an old grudge and that there was nothing they could do without proof. I left the police station feeling helpless, as if I was trapped in a maze from which I could not escape. As the days went by, the feeling that something was wrong grew. I began to notice little things, shadows moving in the corner of my eye, whispers in the night that I couldn't identify. My mind was filling with paranoia. I would check the windows and doors before I went to sleep, and every sound made me jump. I knew Andrew was near. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a knock on the front door. I froze. The sound was subtle, but enough to make my heart pound. Cautiously, I approached and peered through the peephole in the door. No one was there. The silence that followed was deafening. I went back to bed, but sleep had faded. Hours passed, and the clock struck midnight. Suddenly, the sound was repeated, this time louder. A knock followed by a creak, as if someone was trying to break in. Panic took hold of me. I ran to the kitchen and reached for a knife, my hands shaking with fear. As I prepared to face whatever was outside, I remembered the look on Andrew's face, the frustration in his eyes as he felt betrayed. I decided I should call the police again, but when I tried to dial the number, the line was dead. Terror settled in my chest. There was no way to call for help. With knife in hand, I approached the door and slowly opened it. Darkness greeted me, and as I looked out into the garden, I saw a figure. He was tall, with a dark jacket covering him. I couldn't make out his face, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was Andres. Time seemed to stop. The memory hit me hard. His laughter, his betrayal, the joke that had ruined his life. Suddenly, everything I had done became a chain that imprisoned me. Andres took a step toward me, and a shiver ran down my spine. His voice, though soft, echoed like thunder in the night. I tried to find words, but nothing came out. Guilt, shame, and fear intertwined in my mind. He smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a grimace of revenge. I realized that I had underestimated his pain. The humiliation I had caused him had left a mark on his soul, and now he was here, seeking justice. I understood that I could not escape this. Andrew moved closer, and at that moment I knew I had to act. I ran to the back of the house, hoping to find a way out. The sound of his footsteps echoed behind me, each stomp of his foot on the ground a reminder that the past had returned to reclaim what was his. I opened the back door and stepped out into the garden. The moon lit the path, but the darkness seemed to engulf everything around me. I ran into the woods that stretched behind my house. I knew I had to get lost in the trees, that I had to find a place where I could hide. As I ran, the cold air hit my face, and the sound of crunching leaves under my feet echoed my own despair. I didn't know how much time had passed when I finally stopped. I leaned against a tree, trying to catch my breath. The darkness was thick and the silence was overwhelming. But I knew I couldn't just stand there, that I had to keep moving. The image of Andres, with his look of fury and revenge, kept haunting me. After a while, I decided to go back. Maybe I could find a way to confront him, to ask for forgiveness once and for all. I walked back toward my house, but when I arrived, the door was open. The living room light was flickering, and a shiver ran through my body. Andrew had been there. I entered cautiously, the knife still in my hand. The house was silent, but the atmosphere was oppressive. The wind moved the curtains, and the shadow of the lamp cast distorted figures on the walls. Every step I took was a reminder that I was alone, that the past had returned to reclaim what was his. Suddenly, I heard a noise on the second floor, the sound of something falling. My heart pounded as I climbed the stairs. The hallway was dark, and every door was ajar, as if inviting the darkness to enter. I approached the guest room, and when I opened the door, I found a mess. The furniture was in disarray, as if someone had been looking for something. I felt someone behind me. I turned quickly, knife in hand, but no one was there. The feeling of being watched came over me, and I realized I was caught in a game I couldn't escape. The sound of a voice echoed in my mind, reminding me of the words Andrew had sent me. Each word was an echo of his pain, of the revenge he had been building for years. I understood that I had to face this, that I could no longer run away. Taking a deep breath, I decided to go downstairs. The room was silent, but the air was thick with tension. When I reached the first floor, I saw that the front door was ajar. The wind was blowing hard, and the atmosphere felt strange, as if something was about to happen. I looked towards the street, and at that instant I saw him. Andrew was standing at the end of the road, his dark figure silhouetted against the moonlight. I could not escape. I knew I had to confront him. With knife in hand, I advanced toward him, feeling the fear come over me. Even though I knew he couldn't hear me, I screamed, asking him why. "I'm sorry," I said silently, but he didn't answer. His gaze was cold, and every step he took toward me seemed like a death sentence. In a moment of desperation, I decided I had to do something. I ran toward him, knife held high, ready to face the torment I had created. But just as I was about to reach him, the sound of sirens filled the air. Andre stopped, confused. The lights of police cars illuminated the road, and in an instant I understood that my salvation had arrived. Panic gripped his face as he turned around, trying to escape. But there was nowhere to go. Officers quickly surrounded him, and within minutes, he was arrested. I stood there, knife in hand, as the terror faded. A sense of relief washed over me, and the guilt I had carried for years slowly began to fade. Andrew was taken away, and although I knew the past would never be forgotten, at least I had managed to escape his revenge. Today, as I share this story, I still feel his presence, but the fear that once consumed me has been replaced by hope. Life goes on, and although the ghost of the past will always be there, I have learned that facing our mistakes is the first step towards redemption. I never imagined that a dinner invitation could change my life forever. The letter arrived one ordinary day with an elegant design and a golden seal that shone like gold. The sender was a name that resonated with the elite, Victor Darnell, an eccentric millionaire known for his extravagant parties and life of excess. The invitation promised a night of fun and luxury, but what I found at his mansion exceeded any expectations, and not in the way I would have wished. The mansion was situated on a hill, surrounded by a dense forest that seemed to swallow the sunlight. Upon arrival, a servant greeted me and led me into a large hall. The walls were adorned with priceless works of art, and the air was permeated with a sweet aroma coming from the scented candles. The other guests were already there, a motley group of people representing different strata of society. Artists, businessmen, and a couple of familiar faces featured in fashion magazines. We sat down at the table. The dinner passed with laughter and superficial chatter. But something in the atmosphere was unsettling. The way Victor watched us with an enigmatic smile made me feel like I was being evaluated. After dinner, he led us into a game room where a large poker table awaited. Dim lights and the sound of cards being shuffled created a tense atmosphere. Victor, in his soft, persuasive voice, told us about a game he had prepared for that night. At first, I thought it was just a joke, a way to add excitement to the evening. But as he began to explain the rules, my heart sank. This was no conventional card game. It was a deadly game, designed to test our limits and our will to survive. He divided us into teams. Each of us received an object, seemingly harmless. I got a small kitchen knife, while the others received equally disturbing objects. A sense of panic began to take hold of me. Victor explained to us that the game consisted of overcoming a series of challenges, that only those who proved themselves worthy would survive. The rest would not have the same luck. Test number 1 was a race through the forest. The lights in the mansion went out, and darkness took over. As we moved deeper into the forest, adrenaline coursed through my veins. Shadows danced through the trees. The sound of crunching leaves beneath our feet echoed like an echo of our fears. Each participant struggled to stay on their feet, to not be the first to fall. Suddenly, a cry rang out. One of the guests, a young artist, had tripped and fallen into a hidden trap. Terror seized me. The image of her limp body was etched in my mind as I ran, hoping to escape the horror unfolding around me. Every time I looked back, panic pushed me to keep going. The next challenge was even more terrifying. We were taken to a dark cave where we had to find a series of hidden objects. The atmosphere was oppressive, and our breaths echoed off the walls. As I explored the cave, the feeling of being watched grew. Suddenly I heard one more scream. Another participant had been caught in a death trap. A huge boulder had fallen on him, crushing him mercilessly. Despair took hold of me, and I knew I had to find the way out before it was too late. Each challenge became more dangerous and twisted. Victor seemed to enjoy the chaos he had created, his laughter echoing in the darkness like a macabre echo. The tension in the atmosphere increased, and those of us who remained began to question our decisions. The struggle for survival became a fierce competition where the instinct for self-preservation took precedence over any human connection. The last test was the most chilling. We were taken to a closed room where the objects we had received at the beginning of the game were placed on a table. Each of us had to use the object we had been given to get rid of another competitor. Betrayal became a necessity. Morality vanished, and fear became a driving force. As I looked at my companions, despair shining in their eyes, I knew I had to act. The knife I had received became a symbol of my struggle for survival. As the tension mounted, cries of desperation and betrayal filled the air. In an instant of clarity, I decided that I could not allow myself to be dragged into this madness. I ran for the exit, leaving the chaos and horror behind. The cool air hit me as I exited the mansion. As I looked back, I saw shadows moving in the darkness, and I knew that not everyone would be as lucky as I was. The screams of my companions echoed in the night as I disappeared into the woods. A sense of guilt washed over me, but I understood that I had made the only possible decision to save my life. As I ran, the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance. The police had arrived, alerted by a neighbor who had heard the screams. My heart pounded as I ran deeper into the woods, knowing that I had escaped, but at a terrible cost. I looked back one last time, and at that moment I knew that the others would not have the same fortune. Reaching the road, I stopped to catch my breath. Victor Darnell's mansion loomed in the distance, dripping with shadows and echoes of terror. The night was still dark, but dawn was beginning to peek over the horizon. I could not let my mind fill with images of the horror I had left behind. I had survived, but the memory of that night would haunt me for the rest of my days. As the sun rose, I knew the game was over, at least for me. But deep down, I knew that the real horror was not just what I had lived through, but what I had left behind. Victor Darnell's laughter echoed in my mind, and I understood that his game was not over. I was sure that in some dark place he was planning his next move. Life would go on, but I would always carry the weight of that night and the echo of those who were not as lucky. It all started one ordinary night when the sound of an incoming message interrupted the silence of my living room. It was from Eugenia, a friend from college, and her message was full of despair. She had been going through a difficult time and asked for my help. Although she had always been a cautious person, her tone made me feel I had to act. I could not leave her alone in a difficult situation. When I arrived at her apartment, the atmosphere was tense. Eugenia was nervous, her hands trembling as she explained to me that she had been involved in a dangerous matter. Apparently, she had met a group of people who were in trouble with the law. She had been dragged into a situation she didn't fully understand, but she needed me to help her out of it. I felt overwhelmed. I knew that getting involved could lead to trouble, but the look on her face convinced me. She needed support, and I couldn't let her down. Eugenia told me that there was a plan to recover a valuable object that belonged to a dangerous guy. Apparently, this object was some sort of stolen artifact, and the owner, a known criminal in town, was looking to get it back at any cost. Eugenia believed that if we could get it, she could make a deal and get out of the situation without further complications. I decided I couldn't leave her alone, so I agreed to help her. We headed for an industrial area in the city, where the object was said to be hidden. The streets were deserted, and the darkness seemed to swallow every sound. As we walked, a shiver ran down my spine. The thought of being involved in something illegal made me uneasy, but Eugenia's determination kept me steady. As we reached the abandoned factory, the atmosphere became even more oppressive. The walls were covered with graffiti and the entrance was blocked by a rusty fence. Eugenia seemed to know the place, so she led me through a side passage that led to the back of the building. The place smelled of mold and decay, and every step I took echoed in the silence. We came to a dark room. Eugenia took a flashlight out of her bag and turned it on. The light illuminated a large container in the center of the room. According to Eugenia, the object we were looking for was inside. I felt uneasy, but I knew I couldn't turn back. Eugenia was determined, and I followed her lead. As we tried to open the container, I couldn't help but feel that we were being watched. Eugenia concentrated on picking the lock while I glanced around us. The shadows seemed to move, and a cold sweat began to build up on my forehead. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. My heart stopped. Eugenia and I looked at each other, and her expression was one of pure alarm. We quickly turned off the flashlight and hid behind some stacked boxes. The sound of footsteps approached, and anxiety grew in my chest. A group of men entered the room. They were dressed in black, their faces covered, and they carried guns. It was evident that they were not friends. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I listened to their mutterings. They seemed to be looking for something, and my instinct told me we shouldn't be there. The reality of the situation hit me. We were in the middle of a robbery. Eugenia and I remained silent, trying to hold our breath. The men began to search the container we had been trying to open. Fear paralyzed me. I knew that if we were discovered, our lives would be in danger. One of the men shouted, and chaos erupted in the room. Apparently, they had found what they were looking for. They began to load boxes and objects into a vehicle that had been parked at the entrance. Shadows danced on the walls as the group moved quickly, as if they had limited time to complete their mission. Eugenia and I knew we had to get out of there before it was too late. With stealthy movements, we began to back away from the scene. But at that moment, one of the men became aware of our presence. He pointed in our direction and shouted. The situation became chaotic. The other men turned, and panic seized me. I ran for the exit with Eugenia at my side. Adrenaline was pushing me, and fear was giving me wings. As we ran, I heard the sound of gunshots behind us. It was a terrifying echo that echoed in my ears. Every step I took seemed to lead me into an abyss of despair. We made it out of the factory and headed for the forest behind us. Darkness enveloped us, but we couldn't stop. The thought of being caught was too terrifying. As we ran, tree branches scratched our skin, but I felt no pain. I just wanted to be safe. The sound of the men chasing us gradually faded, but the fear was still present. After what seemed like an eternity of running, we came to a clearing. There, finally, we stopped to catch our breath. The moon was illuminating the place, and the calmness around us was unsettling. Eugenia was trembling. I knew I had risked a lot by getting involved in this disaster. Although I had wanted to help her, the situation had turned deadly. I felt caught between guilt and the need to protect her. I decided that we should split up. If we stayed together, we were likely to be found. I told Eugenia to head home and not look back. Although it pained me to leave her, I knew it was the only way to ensure our survival. She didn't want to part ways, but finally agreed. As she walked away, a feeling of emptiness came over me. The darkness enveloped me, and the sound of the night seemed to amplify my thoughts. The horror of what I had experienced began to suffocate me. I decided to go back the way we had come. I had to find a way out of this mess. The factory was illuminated by the lights of an approaching vehicle. The men were searching, and I knew I had to be quick. I hid behind some bushes and watched as the vehicle pulled up in front of the factory entrance. A group of men got out of the car and soon joined those already there. There were more of them than I had imagined, and fear came over me again. I knew I couldn't stay there for long. I had to get out of that area before it was too late. As I planned my escape, I remembered a path I had seen when we arrived. I decided it would be my only chance. I began to creep toward the opposite exit, keeping in the shadows and avoiding making noise. I made it out of the factory and headed toward the forest. The moon was shining overhead, illuminating my path. I felt the air getting cooler as I moved forward. Every step I took brought me closer to freedom, but the possibility of being caught was still present. As I reached a lonely road, I saw a car pass in the distance. It was my only chance. I started signaling, raising my arm so that the driver would see me. The car stopped, and I was relieved to see that it was an older man. I quickly climbed into the vehicle, unable to contain the relief I felt. The man looked at me curiously, and without wasting any time, I explained that I had been in trouble and needed help. As we drove away from the area, I felt the weight of the night begin to fade. I had managed to escape, at least for now. As we drove away, I thought of Eugenia. I hoped she was safe. I knew I had made a risky decision in helping her, but I couldn't change what had happened. The night had been a whirlwind of horror and fear, but I had made it out alive. In the end, I managed to save myself from that nightmare. The adrenaline began to fade, and although the image of what had happened remained etched in my mind, I knew I had made the right decision in acting. As the car pulled away from the darkness, a part of me knew that life would not be the same. I had crossed a line, and although I had survived, the memory of that night would haunt me forever. Life can be strange, but nothing prepared me for what I was about to discover. I have always been a man of routines. I get up, go to work, come home, and repeat. That monotony was interrupted one rainy night, however, when a letter arrived on my doorstep. The rain was coming down hard, and the sound of the water hitting the ground seemed a harbinger of what was to come. Opening the envelope, I found a tattered document. Inside there was a yellowed letter and an old newspaper clipping. The letter told of a child trafficking case that had taken place more than 3 decades ago. My hands were shaking as I read about a pair of twins who had been separated at birth. The mother, a young woman, had been deceived and told that her child had died. However, the other baby had been stolen and sold to a family who never knew the truth. The newspaper clipping showed a picture of a child with a smile that looked eerily familiar. It was like looking in a mirror, but with a twinkle in my eye that I couldn't remember ever having had. The story of the desperate mother searching for her lost son resonated deep within me. At the bottom of the letter was an address, a place where I could find more information. The night grew darker, and the wind howled outside my window. The letter made me question everything I knew about myself. Could it be possible that there was another me? A twin brother who had been stolen from my mother and had, for some reason, remained hidden all these years. The idea filled me with a mixture of fear and curiosity. I could not ignore it. I decided to go to the address mentioned in the letter. It was a small building in a forgotten neighborhood, far from the comfort of my home. The rain did not stop, and every step I took made me more anxious. The dim light from the streetlight barely illuminated the entrance, and a shiver ran down my spine as I approached the door. I knocked hard and waited, my thoughts entangled in the possibility of finding my brother. When the door opened, an older man looked at me with a mixture of surprise and distrust. However, he didn't give me time to explain. He ushered me in and led me into a dark, dusty room. The walls were covered with old photographs and yellowed documents. The air was heavy with the smell of mustiness and something else I couldn't identify. The man, who introduced himself as the private investigator who had been following the twins' case, began to tell me about my mother's story and the child trafficking ring that had been operating at the time. As he spoke, I felt my heart racing. Every word he spoke was like a blow to my chest. My mother had suffered, and I had been part of a cruel game from the beginning. The investigator showed me a photo album. There were pictures of babies, of families, and of the mother who had lost her child. As I turned the pages, I saw a picture of a child who was identical to me in every way. The same face shape, the same hair, even the same expression. A shiver ran through my body. Was it possible that this child was my brother? That somehow our lives were intertwined from the beginning, even if we never knew it? The investigator told me that he had managed to trace my brother to a small town. He had grown up in a family that had loved him, but the truth had always been hidden. I felt a mixture of emotions, anger, sadness, a deep need to find him. The idea that he had lived his life without knowing I existed haunted me. I decided I had to find him. The night was advancing, and the storm outside seemed to intensify with every moment. I said goodbye to the investigator and left the building, feeling the weight of the revelation crushing me. The streets were deserted, and the rain was pouring down, but my mind was filled with images of what I might find at the end of my search. The journey to town was long and tiring. With every mile I went, my anxiety grew. I imagined what my brother would be like. Would he have a normal life? Would he be happy? Would we recognize each other instantly? The storm was still raging, and the darkness seemed to engulf everything in its path. When I finally reached town, the rain had stopped, but the atmosphere was still heavy. I headed for the address I had found in the documents. It was a small house with a neglected garden and lighted windows. As I approached, I felt a knot in my stomach. What if he didn't want to meet me? What if this was all a mistake? I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. I waited, feeling time stand still. When the door opened, an older woman looked at me curiously. I explained that I was looking for her son, who had been adopted. Her eyes widened, and her expression turned from surprise to concern. He ushered me in and led me into a living room. It wasn't long before he entered the room. My heart stopped for a moment. There he stood before me, the mirror of my life. He looked exactly like me in every way. The same height, the same build, even the same way he smiled. The connection was instantaneous, but also terrifying. He was a stranger, but at the same time, he was a reflection of what my life could have been. However, the look in his eyes was different. There was a shadow of distrust, of confusion. As we watched each other, a sense of discomfort filled the room. It was as if we both felt the weight of the history that had separated us. The anger and pain of what had happened began to consume the air between us. The atmosphere became tense. My mind was full of questions, but I couldn't articulate them. The revelation that we were twins did not seem to be enough to break down the barriers that had grown between us. There was a history of suffering that neither of us could ignore, and guilt hung over us like a dark cloud. As the minutes passed, the tension became more violent. Repressed emotions began to surface. Glances turned into silent accusations. Without meaning to, we both began to remember. Remembering what we had lost, what had been taken from us. The pain of separation was like a fire that fanned, and before I could stop it, anger raged. Without a warning, we lunged at each other. The fight was chaotic, a reflection of our wounded hearts. Punching, shoving, both of us trying to vent the pain we had accumulated. It was like fighting a specter, an echo of what we had each suffered. I realized that we weren't just fighting each other, we were fighting what had confronted us all our lives. Out of control took over the room. Furniture fell, objects flew through the air, and the din echoed like a cry of despair. But in the midst of the chaos, a part of me knew this could not continue. This fight was not the answer. We needed to find a way to heal, to understand each other. Finally, we fell to the ground, exhausted. We both lay there, breathing hard, tears welling up in my eyes. At that moment, the anger faded, and sadness enveloped us. The storm that had begun outside had found its reflection in us. We were two men who shared a past, but had lived completely different lives. As we looked at each other, I realized that although we were the same on the outside, inside we were totally different. My brother had grown up in a loving home, while I had lived with the burden of loss. The experiences we had accumulated had shaped us in ways we could never fully comprehend. The night wore on, and the storm slowly subsided. There, on the ground, we found ourselves in a vulnerable place. The struggle had been necessary, but now we had to face the reality of our existence. The connection we once felt was strong, but the road to reconciliation would be long and complicated. We picked ourselves up, and although the pain was still present, there was a spark of hope. There was so much to learn from each other. Although our paths had diverged and life had led us down dark paths, there was a promise of a new beginning. Despite the differences that defined us, there was one truth that united us. We were brothers, and that would never change.